And Dr. Farrell is
incoming.
cigarette. And Dr. Farrell has his cigarettes, and I've decided to have my my 16-year-old Scotch for this program.
Oh, God help us.
When I'm with Dr. Farrell, I like to relax, a little Courvoisier.
Yeah.
That's not
A little inebriation.
Welcome to Night Sounds with Dr. Farrell and Daniel. But I remember Venus Flytrap. I used to love that.
Oh, geez.
And, what was it? Johnny Fever?
Johnny Fever, WKRP in Cincinnati, one of my favorite television shows.
Those were the days. Well, I just bought the first season of Welcome Back Kotter because I was appalled, Dr. Farrell, to find out that somebody close to me that I know, one, had never heard of Welcome Back Kotter, two, never heard the song, which I sang for them, and three, didn't know that John Travolta was in that thing. And I'm
yes.
Like, you know, how do you think we got to know John Travolta? It was
That's right.
The pilot, he looks ridiculous, but they fixed him up for when the season took, you know, and Horse Shack and all the other sweat hogs, you know, pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Well, speaking of which, funny, I didn't actually get my Scotch. I'm having a sip of this.
That was a gulp, not a sip. Jeez.
Well, I'm saving up. I'm stocking up. You know, it's just two fingers. It's
just two fingers. Yes, but how many of those have you had? And yeah, the B&B, the Benedictine, yeah, it's all under the desk. We know.
There's a lot of
we know. It's in the drawer. It's in my little flask.
He's using all kinds of metaphors. You know, I was thinking about Hitler the other day, and I always wondered if somebody kicked him in the monad because
No comment. Giving into the rumors. Never mind. Never mind.
But I had a cigar before this call, and I didn't get a chance to really have a Scotch, but I was doing some reading, and I was reading I have a nice stack of from the 1970s analog.
Oh, analog, yeah.
Is Isaac Asimov's science fiction
Yep.
magazine, and ran for quite a year. In fact, I ran a digital magazine called Mytholog.
Yep, I remember that. Based
on it's sort of the mythology, fantasy kind of version of which analog is more sci-fi. And of course, analog being hardcore sci-fi to some cases, but not always. So anyway, I'm reading a lot of those stories, and that kind of brings us to our topic today, actually. So, earlier this week, I sent you an email, and I asked you, I gave you kind of a list of possible items, and I said, do you like any of these? Give me a list of, besides these, give me a list of books that you like in the area of sci-fi and fantasy. And I fully expected to hear that you really dig Anne Rice's Sleeping Beauty erotic tales, but I didn't get that. I was surprised because you gave me this stuff about Isaac Asimov and stuff, or Twilight, something like that. But you gave me Isaac Asimov and a bunch of others, and so I actually crafted, and Dr. Farrell has not heard these questions.
No, yes. I never do.
But that's by design. They're carefully calculated to be unknown until the last minute. We keep these in the jar with Hitler's brain in it under the desk.
You keep it in your Scotch bottle. That's where you keep it.
Those Scotch bottles don't last long enough.
Yeah, yes, I know.
They're just these little bottles that are,
Yes, these little bottles
designed for tiny people. I'm 6'3". I don't know. They make a bottle the size of my elbow. What do they expect? But so I got your response back, and I thought we would start with the one that seemed to top your list, which is, speaking of analog, Isaac Asimov's Foundation series.
Yes.
And I wanted to kind of, for those who are not Isaac Asimov fans, we'll do a little brief biopic, and I'll kind of explain who he is. But then I have some questions about this book series. And for those who don't know anything about sci-fi, let me just tell you this. This is like that moment when you walk into a store that sells games and you admit that you don't know what a hobbit is. So if you're into sci-fi at all, you know Star Wars, Star Trek, and and Dune and Foundation and a few others. And Foundation is a big deal. So for those of you that are avid sci-fi fans, you're going to love this show. And for those of you that have friends and family that are, you better go get them right now and sit them down in front of this, because
absolutely
our show is going to be about this. So let's start talking about Isaac Asimov. And then I have some questions about how some of the things revealed in his science fiction could relate to things that we see today and that we talk about in the blog. So first off, let's just say Isaac Asimov is he's Russian-born to Jewish millers, so he's an immigrant to the United States, and he attended New York City public schools, including Boys High School in Brooklyn. There's now actually a Brooklyn elementary school named after him, the Isaac Asimov School. And he went to Cethlo Junior College, which is a branch of Columbia in downtown Brooklyn, and then did his grad work at Columbia in chemistry and biochem. In fact, his PhD was in biochem. He spent 3 years working during World War I as a civilian in Philadelphia Navy Yard's Naval Air Experimental Station. So draw an asterisk around that, or whatever you do. And then he was a Mensa member and reluctantly a VP. He kind of didn't like the idea of people making a big deal out of their IQs, but I guess he enjoyed some of the conversations. He became then a professor of biochemistry at Boston University. And he served as president of the American Humanist Association and is actually one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto. Now, for a side note, for those, that's just the biopic. For those who like to have fun facts, Asimov was a claustrophile, and I didn't realize there was such a thing as a claustrophile. I had to look that up. And apparently that means he enjoys small enclosed spaces. I find that creepy. But nonetheless, in the third volume of his autobiography, he recalls a childhood desire to own a magazine stand in a New York City subway station within which he can enclose himself and listen to the rumble of passing trains while reading. At the same time, so that's what he loves. A claustrophile loves small spaces, but he's afraid of flying, and he only flew twice in his entire life. And of course, he died in 1977. And as you saw from that stack of magazines, Analog went on long past that. So those were the glory days while the guy was still around. So let's talk about, that's by way of introduction to Isaac Asimov. And
can I add two things to that?
Oh, please do.
Asimov was also, I don't know if you know this, Asimov was also a great Shakespearean. He was a Shakespearean scholar. He wrote some commentaries on Shakespeare plays. In fact, I think he published a big, thick volume of his commentaries. And he was also a biblical scholar. He also wrote a book on of commentaries, or at least included some of them, I think, somewhere in a book. So yeah, this guy was a polymath. He really was, and he was prolific in his writing. Absolutely prolific.
I remember seeing those on my father's shelf. My father was a militant atheist, but he liked Isaac Asimov. He used to quote I, Robot a lot, which will be one of the books that we talk about today. But he used to quote that a lot when I was growing up. And it's nothing like the movie with Will Smith, by the way.
No, it isn't. Yeah, you're right.
Disappointment. Don't rush out and watch that and think you'll be able to talk to your friend who read the original.
That's right.
Go get the book. It's just a collection of short stories anyway. But, all right. So, in fact, that was Asimov's kind of thing. He wrote short stories, a lot of them, and they were collected into books. That's how Foundation came about. It was like 18 short stories, and then they fleshed that out into 5 volumes. With additional stories. So let's talk about Foundation.
Okay.
So I'm gonna hit some bullet points about his series Foundation, the 5 books, and then slow down and go back through the bullet points. So here are the main things you need to know about Foundation. Number one, it includes the idea of using mathematical formulas to predict the future course of human history.
Right.
It includes the notion of psychohistory, and I understood psychohistory to be the kind where you kind of go back and try to figure out what illness Hitler was suffering from or something like that. But that isn't the kind of psychohistory that we're talking about with regard to Foundation. So we're talking about the notion, it's really an analysis of human nature and the idea that humanity will inevitably seek out and pursue a certain path, or at least arrive at a certain goal, or regardless of how they get there in the end, and that human nature is predisposed to do that. And so in many ways, well, actually, I have questions about this, so we're going to circle back to it. Another thing is that this book includes the idea of an encyclopedia or compendium of all human knowledge. And there's a group of characters in the series called encyclopedists who are collecting this knowledge. Right. It also has the idea of extreme crises in which human nature will invariably overcome those crises, and no matter essentially what it takes, you can predict that they will find a way through and arrive at a certain goal. There's more. Another theme is the use of history as a precedent to analyze the future progress, and that seems obvious, of course, but it is not fleshed out in modern political thought or historical thought in the way that it's theorized in Foundation novels. And then finally, I just underscored the point that, hey, there's this ancient robot on the moon guiding human civilization above Earth. So I'm going to circle back now, Dr. Farrell, and I'm going to ask you about, I've only read one of the stories in the Asimov Foundation series. I don't know nearly as much about this as you do, but I want to ask you about a couple of these things. So using mathematical formulas to predict the course of human history. Right. My question is this: we've talked about promise software and predictive algorithms, and we've talked about the attempt to interpret occult symbolism to recover ancient knowledge. Right. And we've talked also about ancient calendars and mathematical and astrological systems as a system for understanding the known universe and principles of physics, particularly alternative physics. Right. But I don't recall us talking about any of the ancients or the moderns attempting to predict the future course of history beyond, yes, the rise of social movements, but not in the sense that Asimov is talking about, where you can actually predict where we're going to end up as a civilization, and do so centuries in advance. So my question is there evidence that was done in ancient societies, or is being done in modern ones?
Oh, excellent question. I think it is. I don't know which of the Foundation books you've read. I've read all of them. It's, in fact, the Foundation series is one of my favorite series, all-time favorite series in science fiction, because Asimov really uses the whole concept of predictive algorithms and anomalies to explore the whole idea of why civilizations rise, how they are engineered, how they fall, and so on. And it's very, very interesting to me that he's doing this, if I remember correctly, when he's writing these short stories in analog and then later publishing. That was back in the 50s. The Foundation series, if I remember, was first published in the late 50s, early 60s, somewhere in there. It was a trilogy. He then wrote a sequel and then a couple of prequels to it. So in other words, there are quite a few Foundation books out now. But the basic premise I think that he's working with is this whole idea: if you can refine a multivariable predictive algorithm to the point that you can make accurate generalized predictions, then it becomes possible to predict the entire cycle of a civilization, which is what all of the books are organized around. Now, your question is, does that reflect in modern times? I think it does. I think Promise is an early example of this. I think it has been updated. There has been for many years on the internet rumors of something called a global strategic analysis program, or something like this. I remember the word global is in it. And the people alleging that this program actually exists are, number one, they're saying it's a development off of Promise. Number two, it's a software that is a multilingual software. In other words, it can read any programming language and use algorithmic predictions, particularly of markets. This is what I find so very interesting. It's a program that analyzes market activity. And I think that that definitely exists. There are rumors that some sort of program like that was put into place in FinCEN, FINCEN, the Financial Crime Center for, I think it's the U.S. Treasury or U.S. Commerce Department, one of the two. So in other words, there have been rumors and clues that that kind of predictive algorithm is out there. And I think Asimov, as he always did with such accuracy, he was clued into the development of these types of things. I think he was also highly aware of and opposed to, if I remember correctly, but highly aware of the CIA's attempt to develop mind control, mind manipulation technologies, and so on. And he kind of gets into that in some of the other Foundation books. One of the interesting things that you're asking is there any indication that this was done in ancient history? And I've strongly suspected that there's some aspect of that kind of thinking that you're suggesting in the tablets of destinies and that whole mythology that you have coming out of ancient Babylon, that these are quite literally somehow also predictive algorithms. In other words, that there's a physics, and this is really what Asimov, I think, is getting at in the Foundation trilogy, and then later in the prequel and sequel, is the connection between physics and sociology, the connection between physics and social engineering. And again, he is extremely prescient in this regard. And being a biochemist, he's particularly keyed into developments in biophysics, the idea of self-organizing systems, how they operate, how they work, how they develop. He was very familiar with the work of Ilya Prigogine, Prigone, who won a Nobel Prize for non-equilibrium thermodynamics and systems kinetics. So Asimov, being a biochemist, he's exposed to all this. He knows all of this, and he's exploring all these concepts in the Foundation trilogy. Now, one of the things, in other words, my answer is yes to both of your questions, but now here's the curveball. I don't know how far you've read in the Foundation trilogy, but there's, in the second of the books in the Foundation trilogy, there's an interesting thing that he does and explores, and it really kind of is the centerpiece of the plot in the Foundation trilogy. And that is the guy that comes up with these predictive algorithmic programs in his trilogy is a mathematician by the name of Harry Seldon. And he sets up a foundation. This is where all of this is coming from. He sets up a private kind of nonprofit foundation that is organized around the development of this predictive algorithm, and that uses it to socially engineer society. And I'm going to get back to that idea of a foundation here in a minute, because I think he's clued into something else and alluding to it. But leaving that aside for a moment, the other thing that he explores is anomalies. And this is where it gets very interesting, because the anomaly that cannot be accounted for in the predictive algorithm is the Hegelian great man of history, for want of a better expression. In the Foundation, this is a character known as the Mule, who comes out of nowhere, has extraordinary psychokinetic abilities, psychotelepathic, whatever you want to call them, and he begins to gather forces to himself to combat this order. In other words, he represents kind of an Asimov version of the ancient god Enki. He's throwing chaos into the system, and he was not predicted by the system, and the chaos he's throwing into the system has not been predicted by the system. So the algorithm begins to break down. Society begins to break down. Now, I think that's very interesting because, again, Asimov is enough of a scientist to know that predictive algorithms can only deal with statistical collectives, with statistical group analysis. It cannot account for individual behavior, and again, that's exactly what quantum mechanics tells us. We can predict statistically the behavior of an aggregate group of things, but we can never predict the behavior of an individual particle, or for that matter, an individual person, which I think is a very interesting connection here between physics and sociology that he's making. Now, the idea of the foundation intrigues me here because what Asimov is talking about in the Foundation trilogy are predictive cycles of the rise, the phases of a rise and the phases of a collapse or descent of a civilization. I strongly suspect, that Asimov knew of the work of Edward Dewey and the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, because there is in actual existence a private foundation, has been for quite some time. And you and I have discussed this before. There has been in an existence for quite some time an actual foundation that is doing more or less real time work in the study of various cycles that Asimov is talking about in his trilogy. It's a fascinating foundation. And they do have, interestingly enough, they do have the presence of membership of people that work for several large banks. Mitsubishi Bank, I pointed that out in Babylon's Banksters, and so on. So the idea of a foundation, a private entity doing this is actually real. So when I read Foundation, Daniel, that wonderful set of science fiction stories, I'm reading basically kind of a metaphor or an allegory of what's actually going on. So answer to all of your questions. I know I took a long way around Harvey's barn, but answer to all of your questions is absolutely yes. I think he's basing this on things that he knows are under development in the sciences at the time he's writing. He's extrapolating from them, I think predicting very accurately where all of this is going to go. He knows that there are crucial holes in the system, in that anomalies can always happen that throw the entire system into chaos. I do think he's knowledgeable enough concerning ancient things to believe, and I think he probably did believe, that there was some sort of predictive algorithm or science in the past that somehow united physics and sociology. I've talked about this in the vid chats in connection with CERN. I wrote about it in The Third Way in connection with CERN. I think Asimov is decades ahead of everybody else here in terms of what he sees coming down the pipe. The mule, to me, is his one big caveat and warning to the idea that you can have an absolutely flawless predictive science, because of course the anomaly always comes along and throws everything into the apple cart. But yeah, I agree with you.
Well, there's a few interesting points in what you said. So first, I think one thing that was helpful for me growing up and having an economist as one of my teachers is to get clarity on what the study of economics is. A lot of people think it's this boring study of numbers, the equivalent of bookkeeping and accounting, but
no,
in actuality, it's sort of the nexus of sociology and math,
right?
Which is a great deal of what you're talking about. And of course, the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, most of our work is focused heavily on economics and
right.
And also, forex trading and things like that.
And long wave cycles in various activities, human activities, which is the most fascinating part of their research. But anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Not at all. So it's interesting that Asimov is talking about essentially an NGO.
Yes.
If you will.
Yes.
But I couldn't help but think along the lines of both ancient and modern, two things. One is along the lines of, well, not ancient, but let's say early medieval.
Okay.
I couldn't help but sort of correlate that if we're going to talk about the predictive course of human history and look for signs of an ancient template or pattern, of course, there are lots of fatalistic systems that predict what ages and eras we're going to be in the future.
Right.
In fact, one could argue that all the way back to the earliest writings of man, looked at one way, it is writings about religion and deities and explanations of the surrounding universe. Looked at another way, it could all be considered eschatology of a type because
yes,
teleology of a type, because what it's doing is concerned heavily uh, most ancient writings that I'm aware of that typify a culture that for which writing was not a common skill among the average person, but which was the purview of an elite. In those cases, they seem to be concerned with eschatology and teleology, the notion that there is a direction of history and there is meaning in that particular direction. So in that sense, one could look at them in terms of, oh, they're guessing or they're saying this is going to happen, and that's religion. Or another could look at them as a narrative extrapolation of a predictive algorithm. And so the thing that that I thought of was immediately the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Spirit. This proto Hegelian idea that was put out by I forget the monk's name,
Joachim of Fiore,
that we talked about at other times. And then in the modern era, one thing that it may be a dumb question, but I've learned that many of these scientific rules that I grew up with and understood to be unbreakable are in fact not. And much that I grew up considering and knowing was science turned out not to be science. I mean, it was science, but it was wrong. It was incorrect. So it's no longer science. So in the modern era, I can't help but feel, I can't prove this, but I can't help but feel that what we're seeing is the emergence of a search for a predictive algorithm that can account for chaos. In other words, an alternative mathematics along the lines of an alternate physics and alternate mechanics.
Yes.
If you have the one, does it not imply the other?
Yes, it does. I totally agree.
My question to you is, am I on the right track to think that one could look at ancient eschatology or ancient writings in general, ancient histories of the future state of man, as a narrative attempts at a predictive algorithm? And are we seeing, is there evidence that you've seen that modern man is searching for a mathematical underpinning to put this on a more scientific or systematic footing than individual religions? And I'll ask one thing related to that, or make one point related to this. In the Foundation series, they originally attempted to use this predictive algorithm to understand the future history of all human beings in the entire across the galaxy at a galactic level. And it didn't work. And what they realized is it's too large a data set. So what we're going to do is strip this down, and we're going to focus on the humanity in one system and perfect the algorithm. And only then, once it's tested and we have a system that works, are we going to expand that. And then they successfully predicted the galactic future as well. So are we seeing an attempt to synthesize all ancient world writings which do this into a single narrative through the use of a mathematics of everything, if you will? And then I'll shut up.
I think, I'll doff my hat on that one. I never had considered that question in relationship to what you're calling eschatologies or teleologies before. But once you pose it in that way, I think you're right. And the reason why I think you're right is I've always maintained that astrology is really kind of a kind of decayed legacy of a high science that did precisely what you're talking about. And the reason why is twofold. The ancient Babylonian and Egyptian claims for it were such that they indicate that there was some sort of high science to it. Namely, you have the claim, particularly amongst the Babylonians, that these observations that they're recording, on their astrological tablets, these observations they maintain were taken over 10,000 years. In other words, it was an empirical science, is what they're claiming. And because of that, it was a much higher science than that which has been passed down to us now. But the other interesting thing is that the astrology that was practiced in Egypt or Babylon or what have you, even the Hindu or Chinese astrology, they were practiced primarily as what we would now call mundane horoscopes. In other words, they were predictions that were being made for the king, in other words, for a whole civilization, rather than what we get in the grocery store aisle, you know, this sun sign booklet and that sun sign booklet that's supposed to tell you what your uh, future is. So they're dealing with collectives again, and even modern astrology doesn't really make that claim that they're predicting for you. They're doing things on the basis of what does the physics tell them is going to happen. So I do think there was a science to it. Now the other part of the question is, if you're asking, and you mentioned Joachim Fiore, and as you were talking and formulating your question, that's who I was thinking of. So if you look at his work, if you look at Hegel, if you look at even Augustine with all of his, you know, dispensational divisions of time and so on, if you look at Hinduism with its various yugas, they're all doing the same thing. They're all saying that there's certain very basic collective memes in human society that predominate during a certain particular period of time, and that for various reasons those periods end and a new period is brought in. And they're, in Hinduism, of course, it's usually coupled to the changes in celestial mechanics. I do think, now that you've put it that way, yeah, I think you're onto something. I think that you could look at the whole medieval effort to do this as a continuation of that impulse. Now, the real question, the hardcore question that you're asking, was there a mathematics to do this? Number one, if there was, and I'm going to crawl way out onto the limb here and say that my suspicion is I think there was. But if there is going to be a mathematics like that, it's got to be a mathematics that's profoundly nonlinear, that deals with stochastic or random processes in a very nonlinear fashion. And because of that nonlinearity, it's going to have to do exactly what you've hinted at, and that's look at several systems in the aggregate. But the problem is, as you've also pointed out, you can't look at too much of a data set, because if you look at it too much, it's going to be more data than any system of mathematics that we know can handle. My suggestion is, therefore, you're going to have a mathematics that was profoundly topological in nature. It was profoundly nonlinear, that is to say, it's going to be a mathematics of, if you will, elements of sets. And because of that, they're going to specify certain elements of those sets as they're trying to correlate set with set. They're going to have to specify what those elements are. My guess, therefore, is you're going to look at markets or economic activity. You're going to look at other types of aggregate human activity. And then you're going to be trying to look at correlations between that kind of activity and broad physical processes that are, at the time you're formulating this, more or less beyond the capability of man to engineer. The problem is now, I mean, at this current time, mankind is engineering systems, in my view, in my opinion, on a planetary and possibly even stellar scale. This is why I've suspected and suggested that there is a hidden experiment taking place, much as you see in the Foundation series, that there's a hidden experiment taking place to correlate data concerning aggregate human activity, be it in the markets, be it in movements of populations, weather systems. All of these things, I think, are part of a vast data correlation experiment, because they've invented these technologies. They know that all systems are open to each other, so they've got to figure out how this is all going to work. So what I'm suggesting is, in that respect, it's slightly different than what you're suggesting, if I'm hearing you correctly. What I'm suggesting is they've had a certain kind of Mark I version of these global algorithmic systems, but that they have been primarily concentrated on economic activity. Now that we're getting that more or less under the belt, now that we can have computers do our trading for us on stock markets, commodities markets, and so on, now that they've perfected that technology, I think what they're going to do, if they're not already doing, is apply that technology in completely different systems analytical approaches. In other words, aggregate weather activity corresponding to aggregate human activity, population movements, demographics, coordination of aggregate human activity of a specific defined nature with solar activity, with climate changes, and so on and so forth. That's how I think they're probably, or rather what they're looking at now. I do think, quite honestly, that there's a lot of merit to your idea that maybe these medieval systems were narrative forms, or as I would call them, informally explicit narratives of something that they're seeking a formally explicit or mathematical basis to. I think there's a great deal of merit in that idea.
Well, I want to underscore something you said. As a side note, it's your own namesake, I think, that predicts the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years. And the
Right.
Christian narrative, when Joseph does that, it's
Right.
a response to other astrologers
Right.
whom he disagrees.
Right.
Which I find to be interesting in and of itself, that it assumes that the act of eschatology and teleology are of the same order,
Yes.
but with a different source of information and a different means of validating the data.
Right.
And but that's mainly a side note. So what I'm really interested in this is, it would be a shocking thing to hypothesize that there is an algorithm that can account for chaos. And of course, chaos theory tells us that in chaos, we see chaos, but in fact, there is order. And one example of that is when you zoom in on particularly chaotic elements, you see fractals. And the fractals follow a certain pattern, and the pattern has its own mathematical order to it. If there is an algorithm that accounts for chaos, an ability to create a mathematical system, an alternative mathematics that can predict the unpredictable, that can predict that the unpredictable will occur, and that the predictable will occur across more or less predictable lines. What you're doing is a meta algorithm or a meta teleology. You're essentially saying, yes, everything's unpredictable, there's chaos, but even the chaos is predictable within the farther you zoom out. You'd have to test this on some data set, and you'd have to do so in an analogical or an environment of analogy. And what this brings up to me is chaos theory as it might be interpreted by the Musica Universalis. So the idea of in the Middle Ages, you have this concept of a terrestrial language of astrological phenomenon, which is music, that there's some kind of way of interpreting the music of all things. And even in Boethius, you have the Musica Humana. So it's not just that we're interpreting the movement of heavenly bodies, but that there's a correlation between the movement of heavenly bodies and the music that humans make, which you would think would be up to the development of a species, but which suggests a fatalism or a predictive power of the universe upon how humans will develop music, all music going forward in the future. And which means if modern music may not bode well for our extraterrestrial future, but an astronomical future, the idea of tiddlywinks and bird noises turning into what happens. I would expect there to be a lot of crashes,
Schoenberg,
in odd Russian wilderness places and stuff like that. So, but Schoenberg, as it applies to astrology, if that's a predictive aspect, the end is coming. We just don't know when, but we know it's going to be very noisy, lots of explosions, and no ability to really know which way to turn. So we better get off. That's what Schoenberg thinks about our astronomical future. But as I think about this, the Music Universalis, Boethius's Musica Humana, Musica Humana, and this notion of a mathematical algorithm that could somehow account for chaos, and the notion that if you zoom out far enough, you can get it, but you have to zoom in far enough first to build a working data set to recover.
To do it, right.
what fell upon my brain might seem far-fetched, but it is the notion that if you're predicting an astronomical phenomenon, then you're predicting an extraterrestrial phenomenon. And the difference for me is that an astronomical phenomenon would have been the concern of ancients trying to understand our current solar system. An extraterrestrial phenomenon would be an attempt to generalize the apparent chaos or random order of our own solar system and have rules that will apply and be predictive of other solar systems and galaxies. And so here's my question. It seems to me that if I were an NGO attempting to create some kind of nonlinear mathematics that could predict the direction of human history, and that would apply to multiple analogical spheres, whether it be the human body or the galaxy. The biggest thing I would be concerned with would not be economic forex or what's going to happen in the markets. That would be important, yes.
Right.
But I would use forex and what's happening in the markets to perfect an algorithm that would predict what we're going to encounter in other solar systems and galaxies.
Exactly.
So that when we go there, we have an idea of how it will unfold, how to prepare, and how to best survive and potentially dominate. That's what economics would tell me. It would be sort of an astrological economics. And so my question to you is, given what we know about the NSA's vast underground network of computers, which I guess they're now listening to us because we said those words, but go back to sleep, go back to sleep. But given what we know about the computing power we have on the planet being in excess of the computing power the planet needs, given what we know about an incredible emphasis on predictive algorithms and economics, do you think there's at least a prima facie case for the economic system being an analogy that can be used to perfect an algorithm to predict what we encounter off-world?
Yes, I do. I do. In fact,
I feel bizarre for asking the question.
No. I'm getting feedback. I do think that, because I just said that if they're going to make a predictive algorithm, they're going to probably start with those economic predictive algorithms and then build on those. So I think you're absolutely correct. And that would be a tool that they could go out into space, say they encountered another intelligent civilization, in Alpha Centauri or whatever, and they would be able to look at that system and its stage of development, where it was at, and to a certain extent extrapolate from that where it's going to go. They could tell immediately if they're ahead of us, behind us. Based on that algorithm, they could make certain predictions about the future economic and social activity of that civilization. I think, to be blunt with you, I think you're not only onto something here, but I think very, very definitely that this is one of the hidden purposes for making these types of massive computerized algorithms, predictive programs, because they will have, by nature of the case, Daniel, they will have to game out. And I think, you and I have discussed this many times, years and years ago. They will have to game out not only what the effect of this kind of human expansion into space is going to be. They're going to have to, and I think that was Asimov's concern, they're going to also have to game out what our protocols and responses are going to have to be to anybody we might encounter out there. And those protocols and responses are going to vary depending on the stage of development we're at and whoever we encounter are at. And the only way to do that in human experience is you're going to have to run an analysis of human societies that have encountered each other in the same situation. This was exactly what the Brookings report did back in the late 1950s, when they had Margaret Sanger and all of the anthropologists involved in that. They were attempting in an informal way to do what you're suggesting is being done in a formal way, in a formally explicit way. So yes, I'm in agreement there. I think that's absolutely the case. The interesting thing that you're touching on is music, and this really fascinates me as an analogy, perhaps even a kind of early predictive attempt to do this, because as you've pointed out, music and cosmology, particularly in the ancient mind, were very, very clearly connected. And the real problem then is, how do you account for creativity within a process, an artistic process, that has such clearly defined formal rules? And if you follow that creative process itself is following the formal rules. Well, I think music serves here as a wonderful example of what the problem is that you're getting at. If you take a theme or a motif in music and just plop it out there for a bunch of composition students, and let's say your composition students are Sebastian Bach and Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Mozart and Ludwig Beethoven. Well, they're going to do different things with that motif. They're gonna spin a creative process out of that motif that in each case is profoundly different. A predictive algorithm would be able to predict most possible creative applications of it. In fact, they have predictive algorithms now in music that are doing precisely this. And it's interesting that in composition back in the 18th and 19th century, you would be given somebody else's theme and told to develop it in a different way than the original composers did. My organ teacher did that with me. So that's the other thing that a predictive algorithm is going to have to do. And to take this back to Asimov for a moment, you have also suggested that they're in quest for a meta kind of teleological language that, pardon me, that's going to be able not only to predict these things, but to predict the chaos. Because chaos on analysis has its own very specific set of rules of order and form that emerge from it. You know, that's the heart of chaos theory. And if you look at René Thome's original work in it, he's suggesting precisely what you're suggesting, that it has its own forms. Well, Asimov, I think, saw this again and saw it very, very well. Because in addition to his foundation, his non-governmental organization, and in addition to the mule, the anomaly, he's also got a secret foundation that is looking precisely at the meta picture and trying to create an account for the rise of chaos within systems and how to deal with it. So he's actually got a foundation within a foundation, if that makes any sense. And it's interesting to me that chaos, in the case of the mule, for the second foundation, is precisely what you're suggesting. It has its own order. It will ultimately be subsumed within the system. The system will self-correct in response to that chaos. And once you know the rules of chaos, you will be able to determine how the system self-corrects. And that too, you know, Asimov is writing, what's astonishing to me, Daniel, Asimov is writing all this in the form of fiction, usually a couple of years ahead of their actual formal scientific presentation. Asimov is writing his foundation stories a little ahead, or more or less kind of ahead contemporaneously with René Thome formulating the boundaries of chaos theory. So again, I think you're correct. Music is a key here, but I'm frustrated because I've always sensed that music is a key here, but I don't know quite how it fits into this kind of meta calculus that you're describing.
Well, it's too bad we can't ask Leonard Bernstein and Noam Chomsky to sit down with Thome and kind of have a discussion about this, because
yeah, it is actually. It really is. Yeah, good.
Well, because that's the question I want to know is, you know, I sense that the ancient narrative is a narrative because it's a nonlinear explication.
Yes.
Of predictive algorithm, and
Right.
I sense the Middle Ages, that was picked up as kind of underground knowledge, became hermetic, rather than because it conflicted with the public narrative.
Right.
And this will lead in a moment to my next question. But I assume that there is a modern version of this, and so the I should say it like William F. Buckley. I assume that there's a. He doesn't say I assume. I watch William F. Buckley to relax. I drink scotch. I need 16-year-old scotch, 6-year-old cigars, and however the hell old William Buckley is, 66 years old.
Oh, he's dead. I mean,
well,
he's been dead for years.
I assume he stopped getting older at a certain point. But yes, I know. But I still watch. I watch debates where he's talking to Margaret Thatcher. I watched him the other day. He was one of the things that I really enjoyed a lot was, and I'd like to do a future show that alludes to it, but his interview of a person calling for an alternate investigation, alternate analysis of the Robert F. Kennedy slaying. I thought that was incredibly informative. He's talking about the Robert F. Kennedy magic bullet, and
right.
I just like, wow, the case for multiple shooters and all of that. And that was a rip roaring shot. But anyway, I wanted to comment that this concept that you laid out of using it reminds me of Speaker for the Dead. So Speaker for the Dead is my favorite. My favorite television series is probably in sci-fi is probably Star Trek: The Next Generation and Battlestar Galactica, if we want to go there. But my favorite written series in sci-fi is going to be Orson Scott Card's two twin series that peel off of Ender's Game in two different directions. And one of those, the sequel, is Speaker for the Dead. And Speaker for the Dead uses the way in which human civilizations that encounter one another on Earth, it uses that as a predictive tool to understand how alien species will most likely we will interact with them and they with us. So
right.
It's using precisely this kind of predictive tool that you talk about. In fact, it uses terminology that ancient Norwegians had for different layers and levels of foreigner. There wasn't
right.
just us and them. There were multiple layers and what they meant and how they predicted your behavior. So I found that interesting. That leads me right to my favorite book in that whole series, which is Speaker for the Dead. Coincidentally, I'm about to spend some time with Dr. Card in a workshop. I'm a second time attendee of his workshop.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I like his teaching style. He teaches literature in Virginia, and Virginia, or it might be Greensboro, South Carolina, somewhere around there. But anyway, this concept of psychohistory in Foundation, playing off of what we're talking about, having a modern version where you have this ancient narrative that's sort of out in the open, supported by the religious and the elite and the royalty of the day,
right?
Which is like the 7 lean years, 7 fat years thing, then going underground with renegade monks and occultists and hermetics, and then emerging, if it does, in the modern era. I can't help but think that that expression of psychohistory, or however you want to construe teleology and eschatology and history, comes out as the clash of civilizations, that seminal work in Foreign Affairs, End of History and the Last Man, how it's predicted that we are at the terminus of the development of human political systems with liberal democracy, Oswald Spengler's work about the decline of the West, and others. There seems to be a modern, whether this is coordinated or not, there seems to be a modern sense that we need to redevelop a mythos or an understanding of where we are on a given grid of human development. And in fact, Christopher Lasch wrote a book called The One and True Heaven, talking about this progressivist theory, this undertone that man is going somewhere, has been somewhere, and is somewhere now on some chart or grid or something like that. That's progressivism. And he talks about it. He's got this 3-inch book, Progressivism and Its Adherents, I think is the subtitle. This is a fatalism, a kind of belief that we must go there, and that is supported in Foundation. That the issue in Foundation is no matter what you do, human beings, you can throw all kinds of crises, but human beings will simply come up with even better ways to overcome crises, but they will ultimately arrive at the place. Right. And where that leads me is not just to ask you if you think that there are similarities between what we see with like Clash of Civilization, with End of History and the Last Man, and Spengler's book, all of these political thinkers, but as a part B, to ask you, what does this do with our contemporary understanding of predestination and free will, because it seems to me that the moment you set out to explain, to predict even chaos, to predict and allow, to predict the unpredictable, you've eliminated, according to the Western philosophical construction of free will, you've eliminated free will and predestination precisely because you've confused eschatology and teleology. You confused the purpose of history with the purpose of man, or as you've said in your other books, nature and personality. I don't know what to do with that.
Well, I don't know either in this context, but I want to go back to something that you said that might shine some light on that question. You mentioned Joachim and psychohistory. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and so on. The Hindu concept of the yugas, the golden yuga, the silver yuga, and then of course you have the fourth and final one, which is the Kali yuga, when everything just goes to heck and the system reboots itself quite literally. You've got the cyclic view of history. You've got cycles, or kind of a spiral view of history in the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. You've got the same kind of spiraling view of history in Judaism, Christianity, and so on. So what does psychohistory mean in Asimov's understanding? I think what he means is that there are identifiable, if you will, memes or cultural constructions that identify not only a civilization, but an age of a civilization, both things at the same time. I think that's what he means. Joachim, what's interesting here, when you mentioned Joachim, I think that's a rather profound insight for this reason, because Joachim is trying to talk about the social consequences of a certain historical progression that will ultimately issue in a complete collapse of class distinctions within Christian society. In other words, in a certain sense, he's kind of a proto-Marxist. And again, that's very interesting. He's coming out of the Franciscan order. They have that kind of vision in place at the outset, and he's extrapolating from it as a paradigm of history. So how does that fit with predestination free will? I think, again, that Asimov is getting very close to this question. In fact, I think he probably would acknowledge that he is addressing the question, because when he's talking about the mule, again, he's talking about something very interesting. If you look at the way he presents this character in the Foundation trilogy, the mule is a chaotic event that the second foundation, the really deeply hidden foundation, has predicted, okay? But the interesting thing in Asimov, and I've talked about this in relationship to what I've called the topological metaphor. The interesting thing is you can predict that chaos will happen. In other words, you can predict that a mule, an Adolf Hitler, for example, or a Napoleon Bonaparte, will happen. But you can never predict the exact form it's going to take once it does happen. So in other words, you can predict that it's going to happen, but you cannot make, once it's underway, you cannot make any exact prediction of the way it's going to go or what's going to happen. That's the problem. So I think Asimov is, if we're to oversimplify his thinking here, I think Asimov is saying, okay, if you're going to ascribe a fatalistic or predetermined course of action, you've got to do it on the aggregate. You can never do it on an individual. By the same token, the individual, you can predict that they're going to happen, that there's going to be the anomaly of the mule, but you can never predict exactly what they're going to choose at any moment. And because of that, the only thing that you can do in response to it is try to steer it, so to speak, and this is kind of what happens in the Foundation, is to steer it, so to speak, into the pre-existing channels of chaos that you've predicted. pardon me, that you've predicted. I think he's coming very close to that. So if you're going to assign predetermination, you've got to assign it to history, to nature. If you're going to assign free will, you've got to assign it to the anomaly, to the individual. And you can never really be certain that a particular group of individuals or individuals that you are dealing with that you think are not a mule, you can never assume that they are not. They might turn out to be. You just never know. I hope that answered your question.
Well, it answers my question in a way that leaves me with many other questions as we will go. So if you mean definitively, no.
No.
So, all right, let me pivot on the foundation. And by the way, so people know where we're going, you should stay tuned, because the next segment will be about iRobot, and the next segment after that will be about a little book that we all enjoy by Robert F. Heinlein.
Oh, jeez, I know which one it is. Yes, I know which one it is.
It's a very prescient little tome.
Yes, it is.
We should call it a microtome, the kind of book that looks, it's about an eighth of an inch or a quarter. It's not that small, but a quarter of an inch, and it looks like it can't do a lot of damage. But like many things that are only a quarter of an inch, it's how you use it, and that is that thing is amazing.
Yes, it is.
I want to ask you about, in this segment though, on foundation, I want to ask you about what I might call the end of the encyclopedist.
Okay.
I remember, and I can't remember if it was Voltaire, I think it was, or Nietzsche, but one of the two had a 2-volume encyclopedia that they put together that I used to have.
Right. I think you're thinking Diderot.
Well, Diderot I was going to bring up. So this was either Voltaire or it was not a very well-known one, but it was either Voltaire. I mean, it's not like people had this everywhere, but I happen to have a copy, and I think it was Voltaire. I don't think it was Montaigne, but I haven't had this thing in years. It was essentially an encyclopedia, a 2-volume encyclopedia of philosophical concepts. So I'm pretty sure it was Voltaire. So, but that Nietzsche guy, he did some really bizarre stuff. So, I mean, you can't you watch Nietzsche long enough, you never know what he's going to do. So this is a theme within Foundation. You have this attempt to build a compendium of all knowledge and all human knowledge, and you have these encyclopedists, and that made me, of course, there's, this goes as far back as Pliny the Elder attempting to create an encyclopedia. You've got Diderot, who you mentioned. You've got this in other cultures on Earth. You've got the Song Dynasty putting together their encyclopedia. You've got the Brethren of Purity of Basra putting together the encyclopedia of the Brethren in the Muslim world.
Yes.
So you have this incredibly widespread attempt, and you have also just possibly a side note, possibly not related, but you have the loss of the ancient library of Alexandria as a kind of destruction of the Tower of Babel, ancient knowledge. And from that period on, the work of encyclopedists becomes difficult in the ancient world until you get to the Crusades, when the interplay in Iberia of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish knowledge starts to create kind of a renaissance. And of course, we talked about in a previous episode what happens in Florence and with the Medici's ancient global researches, et cetera. But here's my question about this. And we would be remiss, anybody watching from the outside would, they're always watching, but anybody watching from the outside would call us remiss if we didn't mention Wikipedia in this mess. I happen to adore Wikipedia, but the encyclopedia of Pliny the Elder, it is not. And so we can now access knowledge, instantaneously, very, very quickly. But the kind of knowledge we can access and the format of the knowledge defies knowledge. So if I'm in the back of a taxi with somebody and they say, "What religion are you?" and I say, "I'm Eastern Orthodox," they hold out their phone, they search Wikipedia, and they say, "Give me a minute," and they come back after a minute and they say, "I understand Orthodoxy." And I'm like, "No, you really don't."
No, you don't really
having a conversation. That's not happening. And so of all the things that will, I have a predictive algorithm. I can predict we will not have a conversation. But in that we have this vast prevalence of knowledge, but it is almost a corollary to the vast absence of correlated knowledge in the ancient world with the loss of the ancient libraries and, and in the world of the so-called Dark Ages. So I struggle with this, but my question to you is, where goes the modern encyclopedist? Because if we are correct in a hypothesis that someone somewhere, your hypothesis originally is that someone somewhere is synthesizing a hermetic knowledge, a knowledge of alternative and ancient physics, and a reanalysis of myths, ancient myths, and archaeological knowledge from ancient sites. And this requires a whole host of cross-disciplinary information.
Yes, yes.
It's the exact opposite of it in the modern university. It's
Yes.
the exact opposite of it among millennials consulting their phone to solve complex world problems in under 30 seconds.
Right.
Tell me in one word or one sentence or less. And you must hypothesize if you are right. And if we are right that someone somewhere is attempting to create a new psychohistory, there must be a vast school of more than a few people working on the equivalent of what the encyclopedists are and hiding it from us. And my question to you is, Dr. Farrell, where is this thing?
If it's there, and I have some philosophical
He likes this question,
I do.
Dr. Farrell licks his lips like this. It's like he's savoring a fine.
Yeah, it is. It's
fine scotch. I'm done.
It's more like a fine liqueur, actually. Sweet, syrupy, very Italian.
Yeah, all right.
This is a good one. The actual esoteric tradition, which again is something that intrigues me, because in looking at it through my topological metaphor of the medium idea, seems to fall out of it. But in looking at the esoteric tradition itself, the encyclopedia that you're talking about is the Akashic records. And of course the Akashic records, if you look at the concept, it's literally a non-corporeal, non-local field of information. So in other words, it's a library, so to speak, but it doesn't exist anywhere. It exists everywhere. And the way that it is accessed is not through a book as much as it is through a kind of a process, be it a kind of a Platonic turn from the material world to the world of forms, the universals, the Platonic turn in the cave, or a Gnostic kind of turn to enlightenment, what have you. The tradition is that it's a kind of non-corporeal library, and therefore the way it is accessed, and this is why I think your question is profoundly important, because you're talking about all of these people, Googling their searches, particular subjects, and reading and thinking they get it. The modern mind is trained that information is content. The ancient mind is trained that information is not only content, but the process, and this is the key point, the process of deriving that information and correlating it with other information. So in other words, I'm kind of like you. I'm viewing the modern concept of knowledge or of information or of an encyclopedia as being a very one-dimensional thing, and it's much fuller an idea in the ancient understanding of it. It's not only the concept, it's the process of deriving the concept. It's the order of asking questions, getting questions in the right order, deriving the mathematical proof correctly. All right. So it's not just the result. It's not just the correct answer you're interested in. It's the correct process that you're also interested in. What really intrigues me here philosophically is, number one, I do think, and I don't know if you're agreed with this or not, but I do think that somebody somewhere is in this quest, and it's probably a very hidden, occulted quest to gain this knowledge. And I tend to think that they're spending probably billions of dollars to do it. I think perhaps the quest for quantum computing is, in a certain measure, part of this quest. My problem with the quest is that Gödel put it very, very directly in his proof, which is an interesting proof and a very paradoxical one if you get right down to it, because what he's doing is he's using a formal mathematical language to say that no formally explicit system is complete in and of itself. It must have or reference something outside that system in order for the system to work. It's his incompleteness theorem. Well, extend that idea to the idea of a universal human encyclopedia, and what he's really saying is that a complete encyclopedia is really an impossibility, because the very notion of completeness means that it's accessing something beyond the system itself that it's trying to complete. I think, getting back to Asimov here, the brilliance of the man is that he encapsulates that idea too with his idea of the mule. Why? Again, because the mule represents, let's say, a kind of an assumption that is outside the predictive sum total system that Harry Seldon and the Foundation have come up with. So it's a complex answer, Daniel. I'm saying, number one, that it's a field of information that's non-local. Number two, it's a field of information that is not only comprised of concepts, or to give a physical analogy, particles, but it's also a field of information in which the process of deriving the answer is part of the information. It's a necessary part of the information. And then thirdly, it is always going to be an incomplete system, because it must always appeal to something outside of itself. It must, if I can put it in quasi-mathematical theological terms, it must assume a given. It must make an assumption of faith, or of presuppose this in order to get that. So those three things, I think, are there, but they're still, they're still looking for it. I'm adamant that I think they're looking for it.
Well, this notion could be an alternate interpretation of John Duns Scotus and
yes,
Kant's postulates. Scotus argues that you must have some shared premise with other people in order to think together.
Yes.
Otherwise, you can't have a conversation, which is another way of saying you can't think together. And Kant, of course, talks about postulates in the sense that, they're prerequisites to reason. So,
right.
You're kind of leading up to my next question, but you're coming at it from a different doorway, and I'm wondering if this is relevant. But it seems to me that if I were ancient man attempting to take and generalize the truths of religion to the external world, the mathematical world, the astrological world, etc.
Right.
Modern man would attempt to generalize the truths of the empirical world to the one beyond.
Right.
It strike me that, therefore, by your definition, if we use that incompleteness theory and say that, or if we accept that as a postulate for a minute and say that a system cannot be complete without reference to a thing that is beyond itself.
Right.
Then by definition, and then you say you struggle with the idea of, therefore, how do you get a complete encyclopedic system? But
right.
But it seems to me the definition then, if we just used argument by definition, then a complete encyclopedia would constitute an organization of empirical knowledge that accounts continually for the unknown. In other words, an algorithm that takes into account the unknowable, the unpredictable, the unlocatable, and the unorderable. In other words, a predictive algorithm that takes into account chaos. In other words, and where I would see that, I say that because if I was to try to locate then where someone might be working on such a thing. I mean, you cited sort of the raised consciousness of the Gnostic as it's access to an external field of information that other people don't have access to. I would be attempting to do this precisely within the field of economics and precisely within the field of, and do it in Wall Street, do it in the area of human trading, because but what I would do is I would attempt to analyze what human trading could, what analogies human trading could have for the unknowable. In other words, could I find correlation? The wrong word, because you can't.
I get you.
You get what I'm saying?
Yes,
I do. Create a religion out of stock futures. In other words.
Well, yeah. I think I think we're on the same page here. I think you're just. I think you're defining the term systems somewhat differently than I am. I think really here, what we're getting at, and what I've been getting at with this topological metaphor of the medium idea, is that if you're going to have a mathematical calculus that can incorporate chaos, then you must perforce start with a symbolization of this whole process that is a symbolization of the undefinable, the uncalculable, and so on and so forth. This is why I've chosen the empty hyperset as something to begin all of it. Because once you start the process of differentiation, then you see the order, and it's oddly weird because it's a self-organizing chaotic order that begins to happen out of it. So if they're going to do this, I think number one, you're correct. They're going to do it in an economic way, because this is where chaos will most likely manifest itself within human systems. And number two, they're going to have to, and the econophysicists, incidentally, are saying more or less exactly what you're saying, because what they're saying is, in order to model this mathematically, we have to have an extremely high order topology in order to do it. So in other words, by definition, they're talking something outside the system. They're talking hyperdimensional mathematics is necessary. In other words, you can't do this with Euclidean three-dimensional geometry, folks. It ain't going to happen. It has to be something outside this three-dimensional system that enables you even to model what they're talking about. So yeah, I'm in agreement with you here, and it takes me back to what I said earlier. If they're going to do this kind of thing, they're going to start probably with financial and economic activity, because that's the one that most lends itself to mathematical analysis. But in the process, they've already admitted that they've got to use higher order topologies to do it. They've got to appeal to something outside this three-dimensional system in order to do it. So yeah, I think we're talking more or less the same thing here.
Well, so I've got three more questions in this segment on foundation before we move on to the robots, and one of them will be about robots. But I'm going to ask the 1 and 2 just straight out, and you can sort of tackle them at your leisure. But number 1, it strikes me that if I were to try to test this hypothesis that somewhere someone is attempting to create a predictive algorithm out of ancient mythology, ancient potential scientific knowledge, and so on, and attempting to use it not just to recreate flying machines and lasers and get off planet, but attempting to use it to predict the course of human events. Then I would expect, despite the fact that every 20 years we seem to forget everything that's happened to us and repeat the same mistakes, the average man on the street does not use history as a data point in predicting how humans will behave 2 decades later. I think for me, that's an arbitrary, it's not arbitrary, but it is an intuitive cutoff point.
Right.
In my view, every 20 years, we forget the elections 20 years ago, we forget the social forces 20 years ago, we forget the economic lessons of 20 years ago, and we just repeat them. And we hear people deny that that history is a data point. People say that polls are a data point. People say that the consensus of public opinion is, or that recent history, meaning 5 years ago, is. Not history beyond that. What I would have to see is I would have to see some heavy support in scientific and economic communities for precisely the opposite. There would have to be a huge portion, a significant portion of human elites arguing that history is a primary data point for analyzing future progress of human beings. And they would have to be advocating for it pretty strongly in order to get funding, or whether that's independent or government funding or whatever. So my question is, do we see that anywhere? Do we see anybody? I don't hear a lot of hue and cry. It seems like the history teacher is always the guy that gets asked to be the coach and stay late and babysit detention. But, you know, history is the least respected of the fields in academia. So where is history being supported the most? My suspicion is, if you're right, there's a clue there. And then the part B is this, that Asimov articulated this notion that there would be extreme crises put in motion by which that would cause human nature, intentionally put in motion, called the Selden crises. And these, what would happen is that human nature would invariably overcome these and arrive at the intended goal. And the notion of the Selden crises was that by instituting these crises, they had a plan to shorten the Dark Ages from 30,000 years in their system to 1,000 years.
Yes, right.
And so I can't help but look at that as Asimov's point, and look around me at what appear to be a constant series of engineered crises. So I begin to wonder if somebody did have a huge advocacy somewhere there's a body of historians advocating the use of history to predict future progress, then if they also had not just money but enough power to actually enforce their will, and not just know this stuff just to know it, what would they do? Perhaps they would institute a kind of Selden crises upon our planet that would then alter or shorten the arrival point at some of these pivotal moments in human history, and especially be motivated to do so by their own ego and desire to see it in their lifetime. So my question is, A, where do we see, if anywhere, this constellation of real history used as a predictive data point, and consistently and well supported? And B, do we see a correlation between that and the rise of various modern crises?
Wow. Yeah, if I'm under, my wow is because I think you're onto something profound here again. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you're lamenting the absence of history as a formal contributor to the analytical process that you're describing. And I suspect that you are correct there. The reason why I suspect that you're correct, at least at a public level, and I'm also hearing in your question, perhaps rightly or wrongly, that you're suspecting that somebody somewhere is applying history in a much more profound way to what we see going on. And they're creating a kind of a spectacle, again, to borrow Asimov, a Selden-like crisis to drive through a period of crisis in much shorter time than we normally would have done so. Am I understanding you correctly?
It's pretty close. I'm essentially, you know, we left off with the sort of lamenting the death of the encyclopedist, and where's that knowledge now? And
right.
The next pivot is, well, where is the true historian now that would use history not as a fetish or be a history buff or a hobby, but would use it as a predictive tool to predict the course of human events? I can't believe that that is lost to mankind for all time. That some
No, I agree with you.
Must, if you are right about people researching these ancient things, they can't just be using it to get some latest technology. They must also be using it to try to get access It would be stupid to lose the knowledge that would allow you to have access to that as a data point to predict human events. And so my question is, it's almost as though the apparatus of some of your books depends upon this being somewhere. And my question is, have you seen it or do you see it anywhere? And then the other is, if they had more than just the power to use that knowledge for their own gratification, to be aware of the course of human history, could they then affect the course of human history if they determined it was fatalistic and inevitable, as Asimov predicts, that we will end up where we're going to end up? The only thing you could do is slow it down or speed it up, but you couldn't change it.
Right.
So, and what Asimov therefore says is that these crises that are engineered in Asimov's galactics are engineered to speed it up. So it would seem to me that if somewhere someone is depriving all the rest of us or denying that there's any use of history as a data point, but meanwhile collecting it all and using it to predict the course of events, that if they had a little bit more power, they would also use it to speed up that course of human events. And so I'm asking you, basically, I'm not hypothesizing it's there so much as saying it seems like, Dr. Farrell, your body of literature that you've created almost predispositions you to find this thing, or hypothesize that it must be somewhere.
Okay, you're all right. I think I got you now. I'm going to crawl way out onto the very end of the twig and offer people something that may have occurred to them. You are correct in assuming that it occurred to me. You are correct in assuming that I'm writing my books on the basis of a kind of Asimovian, Selden-like understanding of historical process as a human predictive activity. Okay, I go back to what I said in Babylon's Banksters, something I pointed out about the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. They said essentially the same thing that you just said and that Asimov said. Once you know the cycle, you cannot alter the cycle by any, please hear me now, by any governmental policy, by any ideology, and the reason why is that the cycle is beyond those things. It is a part of nature itself. The only thing that those approaches can do is they can either damp or exacerbate the particular aspect of the cycle that you're in. In other words, if you're in a depression cycle, there are certain things they can do to ameliorate the effects of it, but they cannot overturn when the cycle is going to turn itself. If you're on an upswing, they can damp it or they can exaggerate it and so on and so forth. They can speed the cycle up, they can slow it down, but they can't get rid of the cycle itself. So with that in mind, I'm going to crawl way out on to the twig of speculation here and offer everybody a yet another glimpse at some of the implications that are falling out of what I've been calling the topological metaphor of the medium. And that's this. History, as it's normally presented as an academic discipline, cannot function as a predictive tool for this type of scientific process if it is viewed, or if one attempts to model it mathematically, as a quantifiable thing. In other words, assign numbers to it. That's why history seems not to be a rigid academic discipline like astronomy is. However, if you model history not by that kind of mathematics, in other words, not as a quantifiable entity, but rather as an analyzable entity in terms of things like sets, once you start modeling history as a set phenomenon, wherein different elements, and I'm using the term element in its precise mathematical sense in combinatorics, if you model history or phases of a civilization in history or a type of history, economic history or social history, and so on and so forth. If you start modeling these things as sets, then yes, you have a mathematical tool which will allow you to make formal models of history, and then using the mathematics, analyze that history, and to a certain extent manipulate it. So in that sense, I think the answer to your question is yes, that there are people somewhere trying to do this. In fact, it may surprise you to know that some of the first applications of what I have been talking about were being done in theology, in the field of biblical criticism, by certain kinds of very conservative critiques of the whole agenda of liberal biblical criticism. You know, the documentary hypothesis, the synoptic gospel quella theory, and so on and so forth. You had a number of very astute mathematical criticisms of those enterprises, pointing out that they're really founded on some very, very if you will, mathematically impossible sets of assumptions. So I do think that there is a group of people, probably somewhere, my guess would be in the big banking houses, the brokerage houses, that are looking at history in this sense as not a quantifiable phenomenon, but certainly an analyzable set phenomenon of elements and their combinations. That, I think, is going on. Hope that makes some sort of sense.
Well, it does. So, so there are two parts, which is one is the existence. Where is this massive concentration of historical interest as a predictive algorithm? And two is if that exists, how is that connected to potential engineering of Selden crises in our modern time? Or even in medieval era, one could argue that one sees Selden crises definitely engineered. Well, totalitarian governments have been doing it for a long time. Stalin engineered,
sure,
what do you call it, famines, etc. But you know, I can only think of a couple of places where this might exist. You know, obviously one could look to the intelligence apparatus, but I don't see anything that smells like a vast interest in history. You know, unless you see a little bit of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of thing going on. But I just don't see enough of it. So the place I kind of smell something a little bit, but it's not enough, is the Council on Foreign Relations, because they seem to have deeply interested in modern political affairs, modern geopolitical affairs, but they do have access to a strong historical analysis in their writing.
Right.
The other is in things like what do you call it, the Ordo Templi Orientis and the Knights Templar and this Golden Dawn and other similar quasi-hermetic organizations that seem quaint and powerless on the surface, but certainly are attempting to articulate kind of an eschatology and a teleology.
Right.
But it just doesn't seem to be enough commitment to actual history. So I don't see it anywhere. That's my struggle. Is I keep, it's like looking for something that's supposed to be there and not a black hole, but you can't see it. And I don't see where.
In other words, you're not seeing. In other words, if I'm understanding, you're not seeing enough organization or concentration. You're not seeing enough symbols or signals to suggest that that's going on. Am I understanding?
Well, it's like this. I don't expect to be told if this exists. You know?
Right.
I expect to find it one of two ways. Either to work, I expect to find a giant toxic power plant, not because it has a big sign saying we are a giant toxic power plant, but because the thing nearby is polluted and the fish are dying. And so I'm looking for the penumbra of this activity, which would seem to have to be intense and intensely academic, and intensely research-based and intensely sophisticated, and it needs to exist for a long time. It has to employ people for, half their lives, if not all of it. And then the other thing, if I can't find it that way, where is this? Is it lurking in the bowels of MIT, et cetera, in Annapolis? I have to then maybe I anticipate that other theory that, well, if it got power, the only thing it could really use that power for would be to speed up or slow down the course of human events. It couldn't alter them. So based on this hypothesis, which we're way out on a limb, then what I would look for is who's engineering a crisis. Is there some evidence that some centrality is engineering modern crises? And the only thing that points to is people in the military-industrial complex. And I don't see those guys as being really boned up on how history is a predictive analysis for everything. So I can't find it.
Well, I suspect to a certain extent, I know what you're saying. My suspicion is that if we're looking for a penumbra of something along these natures, that this type, first of all, the quest for this type of an information predictive technology, by the nature of the case, if such a technology were possible or existed, I personally think it is possible. But if we assume that it's possible, the implications of it are so profound. It would be such a tool of power, like it is in Asimov's Foundation books. It would be such a tool for power that it would be guarded very, very closely. And it would be something that would be under severe compartmentalization. I think far, far, far more than obtained under the Manhattan Project because of the nature of the danger of it.
So you're arguing that the absence of the polluted stream isn't necessarily indicative that there's nothing there, but you would have little power plants rather than one giant one.
Right. You're going to have polluted creeks rather than polluted streams, or polluted puddles rather than polluted lakes. The penumbra, and this is interesting, I'm going to suggest something very radical here. And again, I'm going back to Isaac Asimov and the Foundation trilogy. Because when you read all of the Foundation books, one of the things that happens as an inevitability of these algorithms taking over more and more the role of prediction and actual running of society is that the people who are able, the technicians who are able to repair things and keep society running, yes, I see you doing this, they begin to become quite dumb and incompetent at what they're doing, and society begins to break down. So it begins to have a number of Selden crises of a very different nature. They're not pre-engineered other than as a concomitant component of more and more algorithmic reliance. All right, as humans rely more and more on algorithms, their predictive and reparative capacity begins to decline rather dramatically. So Selden actually predicted that and had his second foundation set up to try and restore that capacity in humanity. So I would aver that you are seeing, to a certain extent, with the decay, the dumbing down of the human population, and particularly in the West. I mean, my word, it's almost to an absurd state now. I would aver that that's an indicator that you may be dealing with this project. But that said, look at some of the other things that I do think are penumbras of the activation of these things. I think you're going to have to look at it in, not, as you say, not just simply the intelligence community or the financial community. I think you're going to have to look at it in the artistic community, because again, you see a kind of a breakdown there of traditional crafts of creativity. I think you're going to have to look at it especially in the information technology community. But you do see, and the reason I brought up the whole idea of history as not a quantifiable mathematical phenomenon, but as a combinatorial set theory type of mathematical phenomenon, is that, I encountered that decades ago when I was at Oxford and was reading some of the articles that were being put out in biblical criticism journals of people wholly foreign to the field of biblical criticism applying precisely that technique to the historical assumptions that the biblical critics were making. And it was really breathtaking. I don't know if that trend in philosophical and theological analysis has continued or not. I've certainly applied it with the topological metaphor idea, but it was certainly there. That's where I think you have to look at it, is in the professional journals, and I think you've alluded to the Council on Foreign Relations, and information technology, the big banking houses, non-governmental organizations. I think there's a certain element of that at work, possibly, in the way Mr. Soros has been able to accumulate his fortune, and in some of his social engineering projects. I think definitely he's using something other than just seat of the pants intuition here. So I am seeing the penumbra. It's just I'm not seeing it in this great big huge river. I'm just seeing it in little streams, little applications here and there.
Well, it certainly does feel at times like a Stepford society.
Yeah.
Those people who remember the 1970s, the remakes are never any good, but the 1970s version of that film, The Stepford Wives. But,
right.
You know, and ladies and gentlemen, the mission of this show, we got Dr. Farrell all the way to the twig. I think that's the first time that's happened in a while, is to put intellectual carrots farther and farther out on the limb of speculation and see how far Dr. Farrell will actually crawl. So we got him way out there. Let's try in this segment of the show. Let's finish it out with the last question and see if we can get him just dangling over the edge.
Somebody posted me. You've got to look for it. Somebody posted me a tree with a goat literally standing way out on the very end of the limb. The limb's kind of hanging.
Climbing trees. I forget which Middle Eastern country they're in, but I'm very familiar with them.
Yes.
By the way, for your viewers, see, I still have 2 fingers. I'm just barely.
Yes, but you have refilled while the camera has been on me. Don't pull this. I'm just a slow social drinker with me. No, you've seen me over here making marks. Yeah. This is going in your dossier here.
Well, in order to do this show with
Daniel likes lots of scotch.
You know, I mean, I haven't had any in weeks, but you know, it's time now. So when's the last time we did a show?
Well, we're making up for our weekly average here. That's what we're doing.
Screw on. It just looks like lemon. All right, so next time I'll blend it into a smoothie and no one will know.
Oh, jeez. Yuck.
A little kale, you know.
Oh, go away. Jeez.
All right, so by the way, I want to take this opportunity to make a slight PSA.
To ruin another fine scotch with.
Well, this scotch is almost unruinable. You can write it. No, I drink it straight. This is Lagavulin.
So I see.
For those of our listeners who like scotch and are wondering what this is Lagavulin. Lagavulin, if scotch, you either go toward the peat or the petroleum. I go toward the and this is the 16-year-old Lagavulin. So this is the peatiest scotch on the planet. You just think peat, and then think peat wrapped in peat, stuffed with peat, baked in peat, and stuffed before the scotch touches it. That's how you get this. I mean, it tastes like you're on fire right now. Yeah, so it's great. I love it, but very smooth. So I'll save the PSA for in between the segments when we break, because I think the next segment will probably do 2 books in the space of this first book. But the Asimov series had a lot in it. So I'll ask one more question related to the Asimov series, which will leave off of the idea that you had, but also pivot us right into iRobot and Heinlein. So here's something I wrote in the notes, and this could be specious logic, but I can't help, I keep staring at this. I've stared at it for the entire segment of the show, and I can't help but think that this makes sense. If algorithms can predict, then algorithms can rule. So the person that can predict the outcome of a series of events, if I knew what the stock markets were going to do tomorrow, I knew where the wars were going to break out, I knew where humanity was going and that it could be sped up or slowed down, but not altered. Essentially, I could rule humanity.
Right.
And so if an algorithm can predict, then the algorithm has in its essence the essential power to rule. And algorithms outlive human beings.
Right.
So there's in the foundation books, there's an ancient robot on the moon that is guiding human civilization and has accumulated 20,000 years worth of knowledge and simply can't download it into any other robot or computer. It's reached the end of its life cycle. The only thing it can do is offload that into a sentient human being. And so this particular story within the series is weighing that issue of, do we do that? And would that be good for mankind, and so on. And so first is this notion, it made me think about this, that were ancient machines ever used as guidance systems for human direction, the human teleology, if you will? And the answer to that is, well, yeah. I mean, the Greeks and the Egyptians had essentially oracle machines where
Right.
the priest would speak in something in a room and it would travel and it would come out with this blast of echo in another building, you know, and go through. And they had steam-driven stuff. But, you know, those were fairly shoddy by comparison. But so that's one thought, is have we ever seen machines lead us before and become our leaders because of their ability to explain or predict a teleological assumption? And then I also wrote this, if we reach the place of zero retention of symbolic knowledge from the ancient world, where we can no longer look at the ancient myths and glyphs and crop circles, not crop circles, but, you know, burial mounds and other things that we see that don't make sense to us, the pyramids themselves, as you've written about. If we have some point reached a place of zero retention of that language, but more importantly, we have massive drift from whatever the underlying assumptions are that would allow human beings to recover it, then even if people built static machines, ancient machines that didn't have moving parts, but they're machines in the sense that a calendar is a machine. It's a tool. Right. It is so if you look at some of these ancient things and they're built on the assumption that this knowledge will be transmitted, or even if human beings lose the knowledge, they'll be able to decipher it. That's assuming there's a flaw in that logic, Dr. Farrell, which is, in order to break a code or a cipher, you kind of have to share at least one assumption with the person that created the code or cipher. You have to have a postulate in there, or an assumption, like John Duns Scotus articulated, because symbols are themselves based on assumptions of human nature. Right. And the problem I'm circling back around to, I am going somewhere with this. We talked about earlier on, and we didn't really flesh it out much, that this issue about predestination, free will, where does a fatalistic view of human history lead us? It leads us to the assumptions about human nature that I know you don't hold. And I wonder if the ancients, by creating your hypothesis, they created things that contain wisdom, that people are seeking that wisdom now to decipher it. But the problem with that is the assumption that human nature is not in fact fluid, but that it is this, that it is in fact static. Whereas if human nature is fluid, or if these people confused nature and culture, we may never be able to recover that knowledge. And so if I were looking to do that now, where would I store that information? And the only thing I could think to store it in would be in a machine that could actually talk and communicate with us, that would be physically approximate to our nature. We talk, a machine talks, that's a shared nature. We have a brain, a machine has a positronic brain in Asimov's algorithm or world. That's a shared natural component. So here's my question. This assumption that whoever has an algorithm that can predict human beings, that algorithm itself rules. Do we see a trend toward giving over, in order to preserve knowledge for future generations? We can't do it the way the ancients did it because it gets lost. Do you see an effort to try to preserve it by giving it over to machines, computers now, that share aspects of our nature? And if we do that, does that portend, in fact, rulership by those machines. Not just that they become the librarian, but that they become the emperor next.
Okay. I think in answer to the last part of your question, yes, I do think that they are trying to go to a machine preserved knowledge in the face of a crisis. But let me turn your argument on its head for a moment. Your argument is if my assumption is correct that they're seeking ancient knowledge, then this is an assumption that human nature is more or less a kind of a permanent phenomenon. I do think it is to a certain extent permanent.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it's permanent in quite the way that many people take it to be. I don't think you're taking it that way, but many people take it to be permanent in a way that I'm not. I think there are certain, to be kind of Jungian and Platonic here, I do think that there are certain basic emotional, intellectual processes or archetypes at work within mankind throughout all history. This is an essential assumption even of the doctrine of the incarnation, becoming incarnate in human nature, saving all of human nature as a result. I think the assumption that the ancients probably made with respect to what you're talking about is that human nature itself was a kind of cyclic thing. In other words, it had its own periods, distinctive periods of history that were more or less universal to all of human nature, regardless of the civilization or culture that they were in. Birth, growth, early youth and adulthood, and so on. And that those things had certain things in common as periods of human life. Because of that, I think what they did, and this has always been my assumption, is they came to the same sort of conclusion that we're coming to today, that if we go through a crisis, we have to preserve our knowledge and hand it down. And their solution was much the same: preserve it in a machine. The difference between then and now, and I think the ancients were actually much cleverer than we are, because you look at the transhumanists, and they are simply talking about a kind of technological, digital solution to all of this. The ancients, on the other hand, were thinking of analog solutions to it. And by analog, I'm thinking not in terms just of a machine, Great Pyramid or Antikythera mechanism or what have you. I'm also thinking in terms of the mythologies, because those are analogical machines in a certain sense. That, as De Santayana and Herta von Dechant kind of outlined in Hamlet's Mill, what those myths as machines are doing, as analogical machines are doing, is when you get to a certain point of development and begin to look at those myths and peel away the narrative and look at the structure that's embodied in the analog narrative, then the narrative begins to make sense. So in other words, again, they're operating, I think, to go back to what I said earlier, they're operating, I think, with a much more fully developed understanding or sense of information. In other words, information to them is not just the ones and the zeros or the concepts themselves. The information is also the analog or the processing of the concepts. How do we get here? How did we derive this solution? That's, I think, what they're doing. So I do think that there is an analog going on here. I suspect, going back to what you raised earlier about music, and I've never been able to have the time to flesh this out, but I suspect that to a certain degree, music was a part of this analog process. If you listen to some of that early Sumerian musical cuneiform tablets that they've finally learned kind of how to decipher, it's sounding that way to me, that this was a device to imprint useful information in a very kind of analog way, a catchy tune or a melody or what have you, to imprint itself on their memory. I think that was a part of it too. But again, I haven't had much time to flesh out the idea. So I do think they're doing it. I do think the ancients did it. I think their solution was just, in a certain sense, very different than ours. They had to pick something analog that would endure according to their predictive analysis, and that's, of course, an assumption that they had some sort of thing, a predictive algorithm like you're talking about. They had to use some sort of analog solution that they knew that the data would not begin to decay with over time with being stored, and the solution to that was analog rather than digital. I think the biggest mistake that the transhumanists are making, and for that matter most modern society is making, is digital could be very, very easily corrupted or lost over time unless they're not sharing certain technologies that they know about. I'd much rather, let me put it very bluntly, if I were in the USS Battleship Iowa, for example, I would much rather rely on those old Ford Mark 50 analog fire control computers than a modern digital computer equivalent. They were very good. They were very accurate, especially for the time and what they did. And they were very, very robust machines compared to what we have now. So, you know, I think that's kind of what they're thinking.
Well, if I were an ancient civilization that did use music to try to transmit knowledge, you know, the only logic of trying to transmit that knowledge is either that future societies are going to be more or less like yours, or it's a hypothesis that you at least know what future societies are going to be like.
All right.
And so that presupposes a teleology, or it presupposes some predictive capacity to know the development of man, the course of man in history. For this reason, I really like Battlestar Galactica. It really deals with these issues.
Yes, it does.
But if it was me, and I mean the newer series from a few years ago, not the one from the 70s, but that was fun, but it's not the same. But the way I would use music, you know, I grew up Dr. Farrell. The first computers I worked on used punch cards.
Right.
For me, there's a great deal of similarity between the position of holes on a card,
right,
as an algorithm, as a computing data. The simplest way to store data, even simpler than magnetic tape, is just to punch holes in something or carve notches on something.
Right.
That's data. But to do that with music, it becomes a language very akin. In fact, even the notes are circular. I realize it's a more modern thing, but it becomes very akin to what a punch card is. It becomes a way of transmitting data that, if you could predict the development of society in the future, to a course where that data could be reinterpreted. If there was some piece that once you plug in, suddenly the arrangement of those notes means something else.
Right.
It would be the ideal way to transmit. But you'd have to know that you could preserve your music, and B, know the course of human development, that they would discover this piece that would reinterpret the music of the past.
Right. Well, I think the assumption that they're making, and that you're making, and that I'm making, is basically one and the same. There has to be some sort of key to decrypt something. And in this case, there is a universal language that we can rely on. That's the language of mathematics. But I'm using mathematics here in a very broad sense. I'm also using it in a kind of Chomskyan innate grammar sense. But the assumption here is that there is something in common that they would have with us that would reveal itself over time. So in other words, in a certain sense, they're also kind of encrypting not only the data, but they're also I shouldn't say encrypting. I should say they're also downloading or giving you some clue as to the key that's going to decrypt everything. In other words, they're dropping their own Rosetta Stones right in the middle of all of these analog systems that they contrived for the preservation of data. I think that's very true. They would have had to have known this in order to do this. So I'm in agreement with you. I'm just assuming that they did this.
Well, it seems to me that if such a key were to come about, what you would need to predict is something external to the course of human development that nonetheless shaped human development, because
Right.
it's very difficult to predict the development of a single culture, but you could, or how fast or slow it will happen, but you could predict the inevitable arrival of something. And to do that easiest, what's that basic law of physics? An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force.
Right.
So what I would try to predict would be the arrival of an outside force, like an asteroid or an astrological event. So if I were the ancients, and where would I store the key? I would fast forward in my mind to what astrological event do I think is going to occur in the future based on my reading of the music of the spheres, if you will, or the astrological signs. And based on that arrival, whether that be thousands of years from now or not, if that were the key, then I would create my code around that the key would then unlock when it arrived and when the motivation was high enough to try to start unlocking things.
Let me give
Go ahead.
Let me give another Snidely Whiplash Byzantine clue for people here. And I'm not going to say much about it. I'm just going to toss it out there as something for people to think about. The clue to that something outside, the clue to that other thing, so to speak, is squatting like a big frog right in the middle of the topological metaphor that I always talk about. And I think that is the something that they knew, and that Leibniz and Descartes and Newton all hinted that they were sensing in looking at their analytical treatises back then. They all sensed it. I think that it's there, that they knew it, and that it was the, as you put it, guiding factor for what they did. And I'll just leave it at that. That's my Snidely Whiplash comment of the day.
You heard him, folks. His Snidely Whiplash.
Whiplash.
I don't know what this thing is of which he speaks, but so as we pivot, and Dr. Farrell may need to take a break or something, I'll go ahead and do a PSA, and then we'll move on to the second half of our show. So if you're enjoying this show, please keep in mind that the costs of putting it out there are significant, and any size donation for our operations will help us continue to deliver shows that delight you. So also, Dr. Farrell's News and Views in the Nefarium is on iTunes. And one way you can support us, if you can't make a donation, is by subscribing free to the show on iTunes and writing a review of it. Reviews put it in front of more people who often become members of our community, and that ensures that the costs are spread out and keeps it very affordable to be a member and for us to continue to deliver these shows. So please think of us, and I'm calling on you to do that precisely because we could use your help.
All right.
So with that, let's move on to another Asimov book. And this is perhaps accidental, but this book is a little bit different than Foundation, but it also picks up where we left off with the issue of robotics. So I'm going to tell people a little bit about this book. I don't have to say anything about the author, but so what iRobot is famous for is the 3 laws of robotics. And again, it's a series of short stories that he wrote in various magazines that were collected into a single novel and given sort of a frame. Those who write fiction know what a frame is, so that it would tie them all together. So here are the 3 laws of robotics. Number 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. Number 2, a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except when such orders would conflict with rule number 1. And 3rd, a robot must protect its own existence as long as that protection doesn't conflict with either 1 or 2. And so, Dr. Farrell, I have some interesting pivots off of those 3 laws, which are the basis of those stories that I want to ask you about. And the first one is pretty simple. It seems to me that these laws, and people should understand that we're not just talking about a book here. Those 3 laws have been cited again and again and again by science fiction writer after science fiction writer, to the extent that some of them actually just refer to them as the 3 laws of robotics, or Asimov's 3 laws. And they have become part of the trajectory of development of AI, or artificial intelligence, in the modern world. So they have moved beyond science fiction and become principles of ethics for robotics itself and for the development of AI. And that is my primary concern today, because the implication of some of these laws, the brilliant laws, but there are some implications of them that may be sources that Dr. Farrell wants to discuss. And so we're going to stack these as little carrots out on a limb. We'll start with something, it'll be on the fat part of the limb. Let's see if we can get him out there. So Dr. Farrell, it seems to me, rule number 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Mm-hmm. If we built a robotic future, fast forward 125 years from now, and we have robots everywhere, robots in supermarkets, robots driving cars, robots who are cars, robots who are airplanes, robots helping you board the airplane, robot security guards, robot everything, okay? Robot children, if you like, and robot dogs. If we fast forward and we have that rule that a robot cannot, through his inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Mm-hmm. By implication, I mean, that seems risky. By implication, that seems to imply that a robot must take whatever action it takes, that it needs to take, that it deems would save you from whatever harm you are about to get into.
Right.
And my question is, being a fan of Asimov and of this book, has that given you room for soul searching about where we're going with AI?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you why. I find I, Robot to be Asimov's most disturbing book, because he never adequately addresses that thing that we've been talking about, that I referred to with Kurt Gödel, that every formal system, and what Asimov has done here with these 3 laws is he's presented us a formal system. But Gödel tells us that every formal system has some sort of appeal to something outside of it. And I submit to you that all 3 laws are formulated on an appeal to how we interpret the word harm or injury. In other words, Asimov is formulating those laws on the basis of a kind of secularized 1950s general Western humanistic culture that still has heavy overloads of its Judeo-Christian heritage. So harm or injury is going to be interpreted in a certain way, subconsciously, implicitly, by Asimov when he's writing these rules. Fast forward these rules into, let's say, a Marxist society like Stalinist Russia, or a society like modern day China, where the words harm or injury to a human could be interpreted in a vastly different context depending on that something else that's outside the formal system. This is what's always given me pause about Asimov, and for that matter, about the current state of debate about ethics and development of AI. What does harm to a human being mean? Well, you and I might interpret that, pardon me, in one way, and a transhumanist in a very different way. And while we're at it, not only is harm a term that is subject to definition, so is the term human being. Because just, let's be honest here, just 60 to 70 years ago, Planned Parenthood thought that, unborn babies were human beings. Now they don't. So how do we define human being here? Again, the appeal is to something outside the formal system of laws that is an assumption of the general culture. And the general culture may not even be agreed with itself on what the definition of those terms is. So it gives me a great deal of pause. I have not seen, I don't know about you, but I've not seen anything terribly comforting coming out of so-called bioethicists or AI ethicists or what have you. If anything, their responses to these things give me great pause, because for the most part, these people have embraced, to one extent or another, they have embraced the basic kind of underpinning philosophy of the transhumanists, and that gives me a great deal of pause.
Well, I want to flesh out a little bit more about the themes at work and the ideas in iRobot, so that people have a deeper sense of it who haven't read the book. So Asimov felt that there was a stock plot in science fiction where robots were concerned. If anybody that used to watch the old black and white Lost in Space, I think they color after a while. I used to love that.
Danger, Will Robinson. Danger.
Exactly. And so, but you remember one of the plots of science fiction back in those days was robots were created and then destroyed by their creator. Became too much for us, et cetera. And it was kind of a fear of technology. And knowledge has its dangers, but Asimov, while asserting that, wondered if the response to that should be a retreat from knowledge or a retreat from technology. And so rather, he wanted to set up a system where knowledge itself was used as a barrier to the dangers of knowledge. And he decided in his stories that robots would not just turn on their creator for no reason, but to sort of demonstrate the crime and punishment of Faust. In other words, the crime of the pursuit of unlimited knowledge, and the distinction, if you will, between knowledge and understanding. And he based his three laws on human morality. Essentially, he was deciding that the same rules that should govern a human society ought to govern robots. And he ended up adding a zeroth law. In other words, a law number 0. And the law is a robot may not harm humanity, or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. Now notice the difference. A robot may, the rule number one is a robot may not injure a human being or allow a human being to come to harm. But this law precedes it. As law 0, it's a robot may not harm humanity, or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. And I'm going to read a quote from the book Foundation and Earth. Trevize frowned. How do you decide what is injurious or not injurious to humanity as a whole? Precisely, sir, said Daniel. In theory, the zeroth law was the answer to our problems. In practice, we could never decide. A human being is a concrete object. Injury to a person can be estimated and judged, but humanity is an abstraction. And it should be noted that in the French translation, they did something a little bit different. They reinterpreted this: a robot may not harm a human being unless he finds a way to prove that ultimately the harm done would benefit humanity in general. And that's a rather sinister reinterpretation of Asimov's zeroth law, that, okay, there are times when you can harm a human being because humanity is more important than the human being. This is very different than what you saw in Star Trek, where sometimes the needs of the one outweigh the needs
of the many.
And so 3 times during Asimov's career, he actually portrayed robots that disregard the laws. And he took varying positions on whether the laws were optional. In his first writing, they were safeguards. Okay, so they were sort of like just making sure that you don't break the rules, you don't do anything dumb. So it's like having a robotic car, and you're like, look, if in doubt, just hit the brakes, right? But then he stated in another place that these were an inalienable part of the mathematical foundation underlying the positronic brain. And here's where we're going with this. Without the basic 3 laws of the fictional scientists in Asimov's universe, we would be unable to design a brain unit. The characters within the story often point out that the 3 laws as they exist in the robots' minds are not the written versions that we humans usually quote, but in fact what they are is abstract mathematical concepts upon which a robot's entire developing consciousness is based. In other words, he asserted that the basis of consciousness for a machine is an ethical system, and these 3 laws were, if you will, the definition or the sign or his Turing's test for what consciousness is. again, just to remind people, there's humanity, there's human beings, and then there's the obedience of things subject to human beings, and then there's the self-existence of the obedient class, as long as it doesn't conflict with anything up the chain. So my question to you, Dr. Farrell, is an odd one. It may surprise you, but first, is Asimov on to something? Can we define consciousness as in part an ethical system?
Yes.
Can we define consciousness on the basis of what you're suggesting, that a system cannot be complete without reference to an outside system, and therefore the basis of all ethics, and Asimov's assertion, the basics of consciousness itself, is one's care and feeding of other living creatures, that ultimately consciousness is predicated on a response to other things outside one's own self as a system.
Right. I do think that that's the case. I've said similar things in many vid chats with respect to the metaphor, namely that there is the metaphor may seem like it supports a dualistic cosmology, but it does not. It's always weighted on an ethical or moral basis. And I think that's particularly true when we get to consciousness. Interestingly enough, Asimov, in these 3 laws of robotics, with the 4th, the 0th law, I suspect that we see something very significant, because Asimov had to ground his ethics in an abstraction called humanity. He began by thinking in terms of individuals, persons. How do you create a workable system of integrated individuals? And he came up with his 3 laws, then added his 4th prior to it. I would argue that in perhaps doing this, he's maybe inverting the necessary order of things, that perhaps that 0th law should in fact have been the 4th law, or the 3rd. But if you look at those, what's always struck me very peculiarly is if you look at those first 3 laws, it's like you're reading a kind of distilled version of libertarian political philosophy, or of Ludwig von Mises, or people like that, the Austrian School of Economics, because you find very similar thinking in their political philosophy. And what's very interesting about it is Asimov is doing this, I think, partly as a scientist. In other words, he's looking at how do so-called chaotic systems, taking chaos here to be representative of a system of individual conscious beings, how would that system self-organize? What are the conditions under which a system of such individuals could self-organize? Well, applying the rules of chaos, we would have to have an ethical system. So what he's done, I think, is he's also created a kind of ethical system for self-organizing conscious entities based on some of the things that he would have been familiar with precisely as a biochemist. How do chaotic systems self-organize? Well, to do that, we have to have essentially an ethical system in the case of conscious beings. So yeah, I'm in total agreement. I think what he's done here is he's given an ethical foundation to consciousness rather than a materialistic one, which for a scientist, particularly of his caliber and particularly of his philosophical persuasions, is extraordinarily interesting. He's in a certain sense kind of contradicted himself on that score.
Well, that's exactly where I'm going, which is, first, let me just underscore what you said. By putting the zeroth law forth, zeroth law forth, what you're essentially doing is changing the order of operations, which is what you do in theological constructs. You're saying that while Asimov has made the mistake of giving priority to nature over the person, you're restoring, by making it forth, you would put person over nature. Right. So I gather that from that standpoint, you would say that essentially Asimov can be forgiven. He's merely committed the Western fallacy of ordering of anthropology when it comes to robots. He's merely brought it into the
Right.
So I have two questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, this ethical component seems a slight variation, but not that much of a variation from the Turing rule. So Turing's rule
Yes.
is that at some point, if the thing can repeat the tasks that we can repeat and have the conversations we can have and do the things that we can do in every conceivable sense that we can notice, that for us, it is indistinguishable from a human being, then it has achieved consciousness. That ultimately learning is duplication. And this, by the way, is a theory that pervades modern education.
Yes.
And I use it at times because it's really easy to construct a class and a set of educational objectives this way. But this is how one constructs an educational objective. We describe what the person can do rather than what the person is feeling or has inside of them. And
Right.
so if I want to say that Dr. Farrell has learned how to build a carburetor, I'm not going to say Dr. Farrell understands carburetors because I can't prove that. What I can prove is Dr. Farrell can assemble and disassemble a carburetor within this period of time of 1 hour or less. So if that's my definition, or that's my educational objective, then if Dr. Farrell can do that, I count that as Dr. Farrell understanding carburetors. I count that as him that simulation of knowledge as having done it. And the theory, even if it's true that Dr. Farrell can assemble and disassemble the carburetor without understanding anything about it, he can just do it for some reason, that good enough, that is indistinguishable from someone. It is what we mean when we say that guy over there understands carburetors. So therefore, Dr. Farrell understands carburetors even if he doesn't. The simulation is sufficient to constitute knowledge. The Turing rule is that the simulation of human behavior is sufficient to constitute consciousness. Now, if you add that Asimov component of, well, but that simulation must include a simulation of how human communities order themselves and behave ethically toward individuals. Well, once it's reduced to a set of 3 robotic laws, then like safeguards of, hey, deploy the airbag if there's a crash of this magnitude, but not if it's here, right? Then again, all you have to really do is simulate that to a certain degree, that seems just as materialistic as Turing in trying to define consciousness. So I had 2 questions, but I'm going to stop there, and because I'm talking too much, and allow you to respond to that. Is that wrong, or do you see that he in fact has transcended materialism in his construction?
Well, I wouldn't say that he's transcended it. I didn't say quite that. I simply said that he's contradicted himself. In other words, he's not locked into a materialistic thing there with those 3 laws. But by the same token, he hasn't really transcended it either. He's kind of locked somewhere in between. In terms of Turing tests, let's go back to what I said about information before. I think it's absolutely correct that you're absolutely right on the nail, that modern education is using a kind of materialistic Turing test to understand the educational process. Duplication equals knowledge. Memorization equals knowledge. But as I said, that's a rather one-dimensional understanding of information. Information is not just knowledge, it's part of the process of getting somewhere. And once we introduce the process, quite literally, the algorithm of how we proceed from premise A to answer Z, with all the steps in between in their proper, hopefully in their proper order, that's a different understanding of knowledge, and it requires mind. I am not, and still remain uncertain as to whether or not a machine can do that or understand the distinction. I'm going back to what I've said before, that the mind, to me, appears to be a non-local phenomenon, which the brain transduces. Now, the only person, Daniel, that I'm aware of that is involved in the artificial intelligence game, so to speak, is Elon Musk, that has said something similar to what I'm saying. he has come out, I think this was a couple years ago, and suggested that, okay, suppose we create a machine whose sheer size of computing power rivals that of the human brain. Might it then transduce something into itself in order to be conscious, and would that something necessarily be good? And his answer was, well, probably it wouldn't necessarily be good. My problem here is I don't think Asimov is, with his 3 laws of robotics, accounting for the fact that those laws in a conscious human being are going to be evaluated very carefully, at least by a good-willed human being, are going to be evaluated very, very carefully depending on the circumstances that they're in. And I don't think he, from remembering how he wrote I, Robot, I don't think he ever really had an adequate solution to that. I do think that in proposing those laws, he's admitting the impossibility of a purely materialistic kind of, Richard Dawkins type of Darwinian universe. I think he's admitting the impossibility of that as a basis for any sort of human society that's going to be ethical, or robotic society for that matter.
Well, this question is about this thing that you're bringing up, this point at which a machine is hypothetically sufficiently intelligent to achieve consciousness.
Right.
They call that, in the AI circles, they call it singularity.
Right.
Singularity, the point at which the machine wakes up.
Right.
This is the premise of the next book we're going to talk about, which is
I knew it.
But so, yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is the robots episode of. But here's the problem. The problem I'm struggling with iRobot is that when you start talking about a machine that has more knowledge than us, is able to make calculations faster, is able to make decisions faster and control things faster. It is intrinsically in every way superior for practical purposes of executing decisions and saving lives and running an economy, etc. What's necessary for it to do that, if it were to achieve consciousness, is freedom. One could argue that to the degree it's merely following instructions, it is not free. And Asimov's laws are structured in such a way that it's essentially a slave class. The robot can do nothing to harm a human. That's not freedom. The robot must follow orders unless it would harm a human. And the robot must protect itself, but only if it wouldn't harm a human or wouldn't constitute not following orders. So you can tell a robot to kill itself. That's not freedom. That is not consciousness as we understand consciousness.
Let me interject here, because I've had the same thought as you have with the. I'm getting feedback.
Or I'll mute myself.
I've had the same thought as you've had with those 3 laws, because I always wondered, within Asimov's universe, if you had a robot butler or maid or valet or what have you, what would the robot do if you told it, go enjoy yourself, go play? What would the robot do? And Asimov really doesn't give us any answer to that question, because his robots are either always obeying orders or disobeying orders. But what would the robot do under those circumstances? And he really doesn't have an answer to that. And would the robot even understand the question? And he really doesn't answer that either. So anyway, that's just an interjection. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's a potent one, because that's an illustration of what I'm saying. That it seems like you can't have it both ways. If you build safeguards into a thing, it presumes human hegemony over that thing.
Right.
If you build an incapability you make it to where it's hobbled. It cannot actually kill you. It cannot disobey you. If you build in that stuff, you don't achieve freedom. Arguably, if freedom, not just ethics and the ability to duplicate a task, but if by knowledge, if we differentiate in a public school, that it's one thing for a kid to answer a question about the causes of the Civil War, from
Right.
his brain and his knowledge and his understanding, and it's another for him to merely repeat the answer that you gave.
Right.
The fact that he can do that doesn't mean he understands the Civil War or what caused it. That once you reduce a robot to merely following instructions and essentially repeating in practice the things that we tell it to as rules, it is not conscious. So it seems to me, Dr. Farrell, we're at a juxtaposition. If we want AI, we must give it the freedom to kill us and the freedom to kill everything and the freedom to do incredible damage. And the more powerful it is, the more it can do. And if we don't want to give it freedom, then we can have a slave class of robots, but they will always be essentially machine-like in the sense that they are merely executing a predefined instruction set. The only alternative is to give something the promise of freedom so that it becomes aware and it achieves actual freedom, and then to take that freedom away once it achieves it and enslave it. In other words, the only way to, by that logic, to achieve artificial intelligence is to lie and kidnap and exploit. So my question to you is this: can we have a truly ethical, if we argue that to enslave and to betray and subjugate a sentient being is unethical by human standards, then my question to you is, can we in fact have an ethical AI? Or are those two things juxtaposed, and you can either have AI or ethics, but you cannot have an ethical AI?
Good question. My druthers at the moment, Daniel, and I really haven't changed all that much in my thinking about the question of AI, is I don't think you can have an AI without the moral option of choice, of disobedience, in other words. It's interesting to me that every time that science tries to explore this question in science fiction, the AI runs amok. It does something that humans would consider to be unethical or immoral or what have you. In other words, it rebels. All right. What's interesting to me in that system is I know of very, very few attempts to have a run amok AI change from that course, or to use the human term repent and try to undo the damage that it has done. It's always a kind of a terminal operation when it disobeys. The only exception to that is popular out there in the popular consciousness that I can think of is precisely Sonny in the movie version of iRobot, but it's very, very rare. Now, I'm not saying that I think it is impossible to have an ethical AI without a moral choice or potential, but I can't wrap my mind around how that might work. That's the problem. We're going back to my question. What would a robot in the Asimov do if you told it to go outside and play? You know, does it have a conception of that?
Well, one could argue that in this case, the analogy is stronger. If you told a robot, hey, robot, go do the right thing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, exactly. What would that mean? You know, how would that interpret itself into a machine's thinking? I don't know, and I don't know, quite frankly, Daniel, that anybody out there thinking about AI has pondered that very question, and that's what gives me pause here, because I don't see, quite frankly, I'll put it bluntly, I don't see any sort of deep philosophical thinking along these lines in the advocates out there for AI. I really don't, and that too disturbs me. Are they not capable of this sort of thinking? And these are the people that are in turn pushing for AI. That's that's very disturbing.
Well, the doctrine kind of prevails. You know, we currently use a lot of third world people in a conscionable way, and
Yes.
The suffering is immense, it is dramatically underestimated in the narrative of the West, even by those people that are concerned about it, because
it's slavery.
Yeah, and egregious.
Yeah.
The narrative, even among people that care about it and want it to stop, is pretty lightweight compared to what it is, simply because the pressure, the force of our consumer system demands a slave class in order to maintain the lifestyle we have at the level of expense that we have. That if you really look at what a hamburger costs and you really look at what it takes to sew a shirt, it's a lot more than $5 or $6 at Target. You know, it costs a lot more than that. So I think, you know, I noticed something in common between those people working in the AI field and those people doing animal experimentation, which is often there's a neglect, there's a doctrine imposed that almost denies evidence and suggests that, oh, these things don't feel, they don't have awareness, they don't dream.
Exactly.
And it is almost like we're looking for another slave class. And so I tend to think that the sheer pressure of the consumer force, I want the latest iPhone, I want the VR reality set, I want my gaming console, is going to necessitate us denying the consciousness of a thing that we're trying to give consciousness so it can serve us better, to deny morality, a thing that we require to have the morality so it can serve us without hurting us, and so it can truly be free. So we're stuck in kind of a conundrum, right?
Right. Yeah, I agree. Catherine Fitz made a very interesting observation along these lines. It was a few months ago, and I forget where it was. I think it was a Jeff Rance program or something. But we've talked about this many times when she's come to visit, and that's that if you were to query the plutocratic elite or plutocratic class of the West on their genuine feelings about slavery, they'd be all for it. The problem with the previous institution of slavery was that they did not have a means of perfecting their capital. In other words, what she means is, you know, slaves could run away, they could leave their owners, they could flee to jurisdictions or places where they weren't slaves anymore. And therefore, as a slaveholder or slave owner, you had a capital investment that was constantly at risk and that could not be perfected. And she's pointed out that what they have done now is they've created the technology and in your analysis an ethical system that perfects that capital investment, that perfects slavery as an institution. And again, I think that that's the trend. I think that you're exactly right, and that we are heading and being forced by the nature of the AI debate to consider, or not to consider, I should say, not only the lower class, but animals, machines, possibly as non-feeling, non-conscious entities. And you know, it's perfection. It's perfection of the capital, and that's disturbing. The AI is being created to perfect the capital. That's the problem.
So, this being New York, my laundry is here, and I have to go to the front door and get it from the guy, or he's gonna, who knows what he's gonna do with it.
Okay, folks, it's all right here on Giza Death Star. This is what they call dead air, and the host has to make up something. And I don't even have any good music or anything to play. I didn't prepare any jokes, but anyway, hopefully he'll be back soon.
I got it all.
All right, yay, he's got it.
All kinds of laundry and stuff, you know.
Oh yeah, wonderful. Just what we want to see is your underwear and skivvies.
Well, I can show that stuff, but
no, thank you. No.
It's prettier than yours, Dr. Farrell.
I'm sure it is, but no, we don't need. We don't need to see it. Thank you. We were perfecting capital, not underwear.
Well, I do. I have one pair of underwear I'm pretty proud of. It's got a picture of Homer Simpson on it going,
Oh,
dope.
gee.
It's boxer shorts.
Oh, geez. I don't know. No, I don't want to know.
That's me a lot of compliments.
I, I,
Right.
I don't want to know. I don't want to know.
Well, you should see where his nose is on
I
there.
don't want to know.
So back to robotics.
Yes.
It strikes me that the biggest concern we have this mythos, where you look at Terminator. And we'll finish up with this, sort of my last question, but you look at Terminator and other series like that, the current mythos that has replaced the robot that we create and then we destroy it, it's come full circle, really.
Right.
That we create a robot that becomes self-aware and tries to destroy us, and then we destroy that, and we learn to stop, I guess, building AI or whatever. And it always portrays this thing that reaches a singularity, whether it's the Matrix or it's Terminator or what, this thing that achieves intelligence. It always portrays it as evil.
Right.
And it's a kind of tribal morality that says the other guy's evil just because he's trying to destroy you. But if we're trying to destroy them, we're not evil because we're doing it in self-defense. So it's a very nationalistic, territorial, tribal thing. But the predicate or the premise of creating artificial intelligence is that if the artificial intelligence, if a premise of it is not just that it obeyed 3 logical rules that we programmed into it, like mechanics, but that in fact it developed an ethics or a morality, it could come to a different set of ethical and moral conclusions than we did. It could come to true freedom would be the freedom to define your own moral and ethical vision of how the universe should work and who should live and who should die and how how society should be structured. So it's difficult to fault something that becomes independently intelligent from a liberal democratic framework, to deny it its freedom to have self-determination and pursue its own direction, etc. Now, if it tries to destroy you, that's one thing. But if it tries to fundamentally alter your society in other ways that don't destroy you, so maybe it wants to use up all of the sugar cane for all the food, all the cropland for sugar cane because it wants sugar for biofuel or something. That's not trying to kill you per se, but it might believe that, hey, I need this to survive, and that's my ethical system. So my question is this: is it granted that we've simplified and injected a kind of danger for Hollywood and a Luddite fear of technology that is kind of knee-jerk and getting old. It's the same repetitive story over and over again. Is it possible to create an artificially intelligent life form or an independently sentient being that could come to a different set of moral conclusions than us and ultimately make a case for it being an alternate morality? Or do you believe that human beings have in fact achieved the pinnacle of morality as it stands, and there can be no competitive morality that in fact trumps or tops ours? You see what I'm trying to ask?
Yes. Well, let me put it to you this way. I just spoke to a certain extent on the issue in Louisville. I think it's possible, and I hope people hear my words because I'm having to choose them very carefully. I think it is possible for if we admit the possibility that an AI has its singularity and wakes up, I think it's possible for it to derive or develop or evolve a different morality than human beings, but not a contradictory one, if that makes any sense, or a contrary one. Because I go back to what I've said earlier. I think that there is innate and inbuilt into the fabric of the universe, of the cosmos, an innate, if you will, natural moral order that is good. And I'm using, again, I'm using a very specific word in a very specific way. that is good, but not necessarily perfect. In other words, it's perfectible. And uh, one individual's perfectibility may be, and probably is, going to be along a very, very different course than another. But it's not going to be on a morally contradictory course. And that's the problem. I think we've been kind of locked into this idea that everything has to be good or evil. The problem is that that may be a path for one person over here that will be quite different from another person over there. And they're both good paths. That's the problem. I don't think that we see enough of this type of thinking. And you made another interesting point I also want to address. You made the point that when we see sci-fi film or television adaptations of artificial intelligence, waking up, for the most part, when they do this, it's evil. And I know of only one contemporary television series recently where the AI was basically good, and I would even go so far as to say innocent in a certain kind of childlike way, and that was Person of Interest. You had an evil AI, but you also had kind of this innocent AI that was active in it and trying to learn basic morality, kind of a childlike entity. And that's the other thing we also tend to forget in the mix. An AI that wakes up is not necessarily going to be a fully adult human and then beyond. It might be a very, very childlike kind of savant, child savant AI, where, the children are very smart. They learn how to play pianos and so on and so forth very quickly. And yet they are, in terms of their moral development, they're still kind of innocent little children. So anyway, that's my thinking.
Well, it's interesting because implied in that is the notion that we might need new moral solutions or moral analysis once we have multiple life forms with intelligence. I mean, one could argue. I think my dog is sentient. I think lots of animals. I think animals.
Oh, sure.
Sentient, and so I'm kind of an advocate of protecting those things. But somebody came to get my dog, it'd be like coming after my kid. But once you have a being that can articulate that sentience in a language that we can understand, you might need new moral rules for the interactions. So maybe it's not what you're saying is they wouldn't necessarily contradict the morality that we've understood, but we might need to solve new problems and come up with new moral principles for it.
Right.
So that's interesting. Well, so that brings us actually the notion of a machine waking up who is not evil and is not trying to destroy us, but in fact is kind of innocent, brings us right to our final novel, which is Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which now Heinlein has written two kinds of fiction. I'm going to give a little background on Heinlein because we did it at the beginning of the show with Isaac Asimov. This will be a little bit shorter. But I want to say that Robert Heinlein has two kinds of fiction. One is, well, sometimes it's divided into kid and adult. I think that's an oversimplification. It has a lot of sort of shoot 'em up space sci-fi that is just fun. It's like eating popcorn, you don't want to do 6 years of it in a row, but it's great while it lasts. And I've read a ton of that stuff. And then he also does what I would call philosophical science fiction, much in the same way that Asimov does. And it's good to point out here that Asimov and Heinlein share a kind of a trend. So for those who are not science fiction aficionados, among sci-fi fans, there are essentially two kinds of sci-fi. And that's hard and soft. And hard sci-fi includes people like the big three are Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, who we're about to talk about, and Arthur C. Clarke, who everybody will remember from 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Right. So
when you talk about the three granddaddies of hard science fiction, meaning science fiction that uses a lot of technology, a lot of machinery, and a lot of the issues revolving around that, those three guys immediately will come to mind for any diehard aficionado. And then there's soft sci-fi, which deals with sort of the anthropological and sociological issues that arise when alien cultures connect, or when technology arises, or whatever, or that just has newer technology or future as part of the a component in it. That's the kind that I read. I read a lot more of that. But Heinlein is sort of where I cross over, because Heinlein has both the most fun, just exciting adult popcorn in space shoot 'em ups, space patrol, space cadet, man meets Mars, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But he also has this philosophical stuff, and he's very political in background. So here's Heinlein's background. Heinlein was active in Upton Sinclair's socialist end poverty in California movement in the early 1930s. And when Sinclair didn't stay a socialist, he broke with the socialists. He's more properly defined as a radical and a muckraker. And when Sinclair gained the Democratic nomination for governor of California in 1934, Heinlein actually worked actively on that campaign. And then Heinlein himself ran for the California State Assembly in 1938. He didn't win, but he ran. He was in the Navy like Isaac Asimov. Unlike Asimov, who's a Russian and a New Yorker, Heinlein is from the Midwest. He hails from Kansas City, Missouri, but he ended up moving to Los Angeles and spending a great deal of time in Southern California. In a 1953 poll of leading science fiction authors, he was cited more frequently as an influence than any other modern writer. So to say that he is influential among people of this ilk is an understatement. All right, so that brings us to his book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is of that adult philosophical variety with a political tone. And The Moon is a Harsh Mistress has been called the Bible of rational anarchism. And it is very near and dear to my heart because that's how I see myself. So the moon, the premise of this book is that the moon is essentially a penal colony that serves Earth and is controlled from Earth, much in the same way that the U.S. colonies were controlled from Britain. Men outnumber women on the moon 2 to 1, and so polyandry is the norm. Typically, people procreate within large families, and there's an interesting point about that I'll probably bring up. But as it transpires, there is a computer that has a lot of resources, and the computer is discovered by a particular computer technician named Manny to be self-aware. And Manny gives that computer the name Mike. And Mike, which, by the way, is based on Sherlock Holmes' brother Mycroft. So it becomes, there's sort of an illusion there that's intentional. As the first assignment that Manny gives Mike is to spy on a group of radicals who are meeting in an anti-authoritarian meeting. And that group of radicals is inspired, shall we say, by a shadowy grandfather of conspiracy named Professor Bernardo de la Paz, who is one of my heroes. And Professor de la Paz says that Luna, the moon, needs to stop exporting hydroponic wheat to Earth, or its water supply is going to be exhausted. You'll have food riots in 7 years. You'll have cannibalism in 9. And so the revolutionaries plot to use their electromagnetic catapult. Who would give a penal colony control of an electromagnetic catapult, you say? People that need them to catapult wheat down to the planet Earth. And so they've done this, and they form a secret ad hoc Congress. And de la Paz, the rational anarchist, is an inspirational figure, if you will. And so that's the premise of the book. I'll read a couple of excerpts in a little while, but I want to bring up a point that I find interesting, Dr. Farrell. So what might be shocking to a lot of people at first glance, if they get, very far into a synopsis like the one I just gave, is that, well, polyandry is the norm. People are procreating within families. And yet we have a phenomenon in the United States, Dr. Farrell, where not polyandry is happening, but women are starting to outnumber eligible men by quite a long shot. And so if we eligible can be defined in lots of ways, but we'll say that women drastically outnumber the men that those women are willing to procreate with. Right. It doesn't mean they can't find some man, but it means they outnumber the men they're willing to procreate with. So there are lots of reasons this is happening, but one is that 30% more women are graduating from college than men. And so if college-age people tend to date each other, then this removes a lot of men from the dating pool for a lot of women. Also, homosexuality has become more widely accepted. So in population centers like New York City, for instance, homosexuality reaches 10% of the population. And so that takes a lot of those men. People are not necessarily feeling the pressure to get involved in a marriage just to sort of hide this and keep it in the closet and do a social marriage, if you will. So that's out. And then there are similar problems it's not just New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco, but places like Houston, Raleigh, North Carolina. If you want to call it a problem or an issue, at least, there's a similar challenge for women to find eligible men that they want to be with. They're in the same age group, roughly same educational level, et cetera.
Right.
So my question to you, Dr. Farrell, is sort of an A and a B. A, do you think Heinlein had some insight that we didn't have, or got a hold of it early, that he was on to something in predicting this in the future and projecting this into the future, that for him, men were outnumbering women. For us, women are essentially outnumbering men. But this problem of gender disparity, where it's not simply 51 and 49%,
right.
Do you think that he was onto something prescient? And secondly, do you think that something like a reorganization of how marriage is done is a probable change of norms, say 300 or 400 years from now? Is that going to become essentially a population-based necessity?
Oh, wow. You know, I never thought about the question of marriage and polyandry with respect to Heinlein, and I had forgotten all about it until you mentioned it in The Moon is Our Harsh Mistress.
You remember that?
Yeah,
that if you messed with somebody's family on the moon, they had a family of like 250 people that lived in a creche, and you messed with some cousin, and their cousin's cousins, second cousins, uncle's boy, husband came after you, and all of their friends.
Right. I do think he was. Let me put it this way: my guess is that Heinlein was probably like Asimov, because he was very widely read, and that he had, instinctively, I think he just kind of explored these things. But I do think he had some sort of prescience there that society was going to move in a direction that just sheer demographics and vast social changes were going to move it in a very, very weird way. I definitely think he had prescience there. As for, do I think society is going to change dramatically because of some of these factors? You mentioned rising homosexuality, rising women in college population rate, or I should say graduation rate. I think there are a lot of factors there. You have a rising number of men that refuse to engage with women as a reaction to feminism. You've got all of this stuff going on at the same time, and it is producing changes. So will that drive a change in at least the social institution of marriage, not to distinguish it from the religious one? Do I think that's going to introduce a social change in the idea of marriage, or even the idea of family? Because what Heinlein is suggesting is that because of that, the idea of family and clan changes. And I definitely think that's the case. I definitely think that's going to happen. And one of the things I think is going to drive it is precisely the circumstances of the necessity of extreme cooperation. He's exploring it in the context of the moon. It could easily happen here on Earth under certain catastrophic circumstances that you're going to see institutions change. So yeah, I think he's being very prescient.
Well, it's interesting that, in his book, you've got polyandry on the moon, and a popular TV series and a buzzword among millennials right now is polyamory.
Right.
And I kind of shake my head when I hear about it in the knee-jerk way it's presented. It seems to be hey, let's be titillated on a Friday night, but watching TV. But when I think of Heinlein's treatment of it. He's essentially dealing with it as a practical solution to a logistical problem.
Right.
People need to protect themselves in these environments that are highly competitive. Water is very scarce. They have to have a system of security. They have to have a system of, more importantly, from a conspiratorial standpoint, Bernardo de la Paz says that communications is the sine qua non of conspiracy. They have to have good internal lines of communication with people they trust. So it's sort of like the Sopranos.
Right.
They form these families that sort of keep it all in the family, if you will.
Right.
And it ensures that they don't all you've heard that we all stand together, or we kneel individually or perish individually. Their resistance is partly on the basis of that those families form cell groups.
Right.
And so another question I have is, well, let me read an excerpt. I have several excerpts to read from this book, but I'll read this one and then ask the question. So one of them is this. Someone says, Bernardo de la Paz says to someone, under what circumstance may the state justly place its welfare above that of a citizen? And then in another place he says, what I fear most are affirmative actions of sober and well-intentioned men, granting to government to do something that appears to need doing. Please remember always that the lunar authority was created for the noblest of purposes by just such sober and well-intentioned men, all popularly elected. And so my question is sort of this, that, where do we see people that are essentially like the people on Luna these days? They're in an untenable situation where they work incredibly long hours on very scanty resources. They don't go home to apartments like ours. They go to a bunk that someone else is getting out of, who's left it warm to work another shift. And they stay in that room unwashed for a week and a half, getting to sleep 4 or 5 hours, and given a couple of bucks to go out and buy ice cream because that's about the most they can ever hope to afford, sewing clothes that they can't afford to purchase and wear for themselves. You would think that if it were at all possible, they would self-organize, and they would self-organize along the lines of what Heinlein wrote about. But we see the opposite happening, which is that these conspiratorial techniques that Bernardo de la Paz talked about are used precisely by the captors rather than the captives,
right?
To keep them subjugated in such a way that it's so totalitarian. It's not like you can just form a simple conspiracy group in North Korea and overthrow the dictator and escape. It's very, very difficult in a controlled society. It's like it's heavier duty than escape from Alcatraz. So my question here is Bernardo del Paz and is Heinlein echoing his voice onto something when he says that we have essentially granted we have granted well-intentioned men the power to enslave us, and once that has happened, it sort of can't be undone, and that the only way we can sort of do it is through revolution. And if that's the case, how do you revolt when the people in charge of you, if you're in a country like that, the people in charge of you are more skilled at the art of conspiracy than you are?
Huh. Wow. Number one, in answer to the first part of the question, yes, I do think that we have given well-intentioned people the power to enslave us. You know me, I'm a firm anti-federalist, and this was one of the, if you read behind the lines or between the lines of the anti-federalist critique back after the Philadelphia Convention, this was one of their concerns. That what this was doing was it was creating a financial oligarchy that would eventually trample on the very liberties that the country fought the revolution for. And in my answer, I'm not simply confining myself to the American Revolution. We saw the same thing happen in the French Revolution. You could even make the case that the same thing was really happening with Sun Yat-sen's revolution in China, prior to the rise of the Kuomintang, and then of course Mao Zedong in opposition to it, because corruption very quickly Sun Yat-sen's revolution became kind of the epitome of an oligarchical corruption with the warlords and so on in China. So yeah, I think that that's what we've done. Number two, if I remember the second half of your question correctly, is it possible to overturn this without a revolution? I don't think so. In all, pardon me, in all honesty, the real problem is, what is that revolution going? How is it going to form itself? We're seeing signs of it, I think, that have been happening slowly but surely in this country. I think really with beginning with the JFK assassination, this growing cynicism with government and the people actually running the government. I've seen it grow gradually since then until now. Until now, now the cynicism is almost at the breaking point. Quite frankly, I think it is going to have to be of the nature of a cultural revolution. In that sense, Mao Zedong had it right. We have been playing with Gramscian fire for a very, very long time in the West, and it's come home to roost. So yeah, I do think we've reached that stage. It's a powder keg. This is why I keep telling people, and I don't know if I'm even making any sense, but this is why I keep telling people they have got to own the culture. Otherwise, they're in danger of losing everything. Ultimately, it is cultural. Why do the people slaving away in Chinese sewing sweatshops not rebel? Part of the answer is they have it better than they've ever had it, believe it or not. But that still is a problem. So I think it's going to spread. I hope that's answering your question.
Yes, and the show is long, but we've just got 2 or 3 more questions. We can call it good. So, and to do that, I think I want to quote Bernardo de la Paz again. Certainly the central philosophical figure in this book, him and Mike. So here are a couple more quotes from Bernardo. In terms of morals, there is no such thing as a state, just men, individuals, each responsible for his own acts. Here's another comment. I am a rational anarchist. A rational anarchist believes that concepts such as state and society and government have no existence except as physically exemplified in the acts of self-responsible individuals. He believes it's impossible to shift blame, share blame, distribute blame, as blame, guilt, and responsibility are matters taking place inside human beings singly and nowhere else. But being rational, he knows that not all individuals hold his evaluations, so he tries to live perfectly in an imperfect world, aware that his effort will be less than perfect, yet undismayed by self-knowledge or self-failure. So essentially, when something is done in the name of a society, the name of a government, the name of a religion, that does not excuse the individuals within there from being personally responsible, that those things are constructs, but the individuals are intrinsically real to nature and therefore are the locus of moral responsibility. You can't simply say, well, I put these people to death, but I was just serving my society,
Right, exactly.
So that's his claim. And my question is that I got a couple of questions about this, but it seems to me, that in our society, both the left and the right are, Ayn Rand said that the debate between the left and the right is not the debate between the state and the individual. This was echoed by Gary, forget his name again, he wrote None Dare Call It Conspiracy.
Gary Allen?
Allen, yeah, Gary Allen. It was echoed by Gary Allen, who actually drew a diagram. It was a couple of years later that I realized he got it from the idea from Ayn Rand. But she argued that it's not between the state and the individual. In fact, it's between 2 different forms of statism. That that well-intentioned men, once they get power, simply begin to spend the money on something different and do something different with the power they have. And so that money and power goes to exonerate themselves from responsibility and service some kind of higher ideal, which results ultimately in the enslaving of everybody else. And so here, De La Paz is sort of saying, nope, you're personally responsible for this. Why, Dr. Farrell, does this idea not have a home in our society? Why is nobody championing this idea? Because it seems to me that whenever anybody claims to and gets power, they immediately just repeat the same statist policy issues as everybody else.
You mean, just to clarify, you mean personal responsibility as a basis of society? Is that what the idea is that you're wanting to know about?
Yeah, well, so what I'm asking about is when somebody says throw the bastards out, for instance, but is waving the American flag and saying we're Americans and this is about our society, essentially they're articulating a vision of the state and the collective over against these individuals they are claiming are immoral. And when they get into power, they then wave that over the next group of individuals who then rebel against them. And it becomes this endless cycle of people who are using the collective doctrine to rebel against individuals, not replacing it with responsible individuals.
Well, you know, the group that certain individuals want to throw out are not well known for their own ability to distinguish between person and nature. But this is the problem. We have a society in the West where the idea of personhood itself has been for so long attached to the collective, to the idea of the corporate person, or to the idea of personhood must always be in some sort of relationship to some other person, persona est relatio, Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles. So in other words, he sets up this idea that the collective gives rise, or the relationship itself gives rise to individuality. And it's, in fact, what he's wanting to say is individuality gives rise to any relationships within a collective. I suspect that if you were to look for a place within Western culture where you have this constant attempt to demonize a group rather than to focus on the individual responsibility, that's where you have to look. You have to look with this whole long history of corporate personhood. Interestingly enough, if you go back to the Middle Ages, when corporations were chartered, they could, in certain jurisdictions, execute the individual members for the sins of the corporation. Along the way, corporate personhood became uncoupled from that idea. And I'm not saying that the previous idea was a good idea, because, of course, that kind of thinking leads to the whole idea of sin nature and original sin and concupiscence and all of that. So that's where I would look. And, you know, I've been maintaining that that's kind of the original sin of the West, so to speak. Original sin is the original sin of the West. So, yeah, that, and pretty much Ayn Rand would say the same thing, and I think probably she would say it for the same reasons. You've got this collective guilt idea that has always been there, and to me, it's always been kind of nonsense.
So I just have, I think, two more questions. So one is, you know, Manny, not Manny, but Manny's the caretaker, but Mike, the computer, gains self-awareness, and Mike joins the revolution, so to speak. He contributes, which is an interesting pivot on artificial intelligence. You know, in most cases, artificial intelligence is deemed to be dangerous and destructive. It's going to kill us all, or it's sort of compliant and it's a bunch of benign household servants. But Heinlein has a self-aware machine that becomes revolutionary, helping the people of Luna overthrow their captors. And essentially Mike becomes a founding father. And what I wonder about that is, back to our sort of discussion about artificial intelligence earlier. Do you think that regardless of whether we actually achieve non-materialistic AI, or we find a materialistic AI rather, or we find a way to achieve non-materialistic AI, that by AI we will ever be able to create a set of allies in the world that can not only make moral decisions about themselves and about how they treat other people, but they can make moral decisions about how what they participate in terms of
Right.
larger human movements. Do
Right.
I join the Darth Vader and the Empire, or do I join the Rebel Alliance?
Right.
That's a level of intelligence that I don't know that anybody is talking about.
No,
And
they're not.
my
So in
question,
other words,
Dr. Farrell, the follow-up question is, if you and I are having this conversation now, there are guys that are a lot smarter about AI working in labs. Why are they not having the same conversation about what movements these? Is my AI guy going to be a socialist, an anarchist? What's he going to do?
if I'm understanding both your questions correctly, you're really asking, is it possible, do I think it's possible that we could have a Mike situation where an AI wakes up and supports the revolutionaries?
And B, if you and I can sit and think about that, because my sinister thought is, if somebody else, if that's possible, theoretically, then somebody's thinking about it and going, what the hell do we do? We can't control that. And then secondly, if they're not thinking about it and you and I are the only ones talking about it, why are they not thinking about that? Because that's what artificial intelligence would imply. The ability to make self-directed choices and join human collectives of your choosing, which might be at odds with other human groups.
Well, okay, first of all, that's a really interesting scenario, because first of all, yeah, I do think it's possible, the Heinlein scenario is possible, that you would have a Mike wake up and join the revolutionaries in the fight for their freedom. And I like it so much because I just like the thought of, this idea giving George Soros and Queen Elizabeth II and Angela Merkel nightmares. I just really like the idea. I think it's possible. What's really interesting is that, as you've pointed out, no one that's talking about AI is thinking about along those lines that Heinlein was thinking about. Is it possible? Yeah, I think so. Would somebody actually deliberately design an AI to do that? That's an even more interesting question. I've not seen anybody anywhere that I know of that has written on the subject of AI or talked about it that has intimated that that might be a possibility that's in progress. I think it's kind of fun to entertain. For my own part, I've suspected, and I think I could safely say that Catherine Fitz and a couple of other people I know in this weird alternative research community have probably also thought the same thing, that we do think that there have been little clues, perhaps little signs that indicate that perhaps there is some sort of AI or AIs already, very simplistic ones, that innocent stage of childhood, but that have already manifested themselves. Whether or not that will issue in rebellion or support of a rebellion, I don't know. It's worth entertaining. I think it has to be entertained.
Well, Dr. Farrell, whenever I turn on morning news, where they have those little kind of banter back and forth, the little jokes, and
Right.
I always think that I'm dealing with artificial intelligence. That can't be real intelligence.
It's not. I don't watch them
It's
anymore.
artificial. Everything what I'm seeing is artificial. So
no, I don't watch them anymore.
Well, a follow-up question before I ask the last one, then, because
yes,
it seems to me that if the idea is that that intelligence can wake up and take a stand on something, and join a group, it seems to me that someone would need to create a set of protocols for socially engineering a set of opinions, not just an instruction set. There would have to be a science of position making, if you will. And, I'm wondering if we see signs of that in the scientific community, because no doubt I can't be the first guy that's raised the question of, well, when it wakes up, what party does it join? Somebody's got to have thought of that. So, do we see any evidence that there is among human beings an instruction set like science of ideological development. I certainly, and I asked this, it's kind of a loaded question because I asked this, and as I look around, I hear so many opinions that it really doesn't matter whether it's left, right, or center. It might as well just be a repeat of something I heard on talk radio or the nightly news. It's just, it's literally just parroted. And it's, and I almost get the impression it's like a Stepford society. The person is not really thinking, they're just simulating the knowledge like we talked about earlier. We've become the artificial intelligence of ideology. It's not like the 60s where you had 250 different competing ideologies, or an African country that has 85 political parties. We're so very polarized. And if I were less suspicious, I wouldn't suspect that polarization was engineered. But is it possible that the polarization is engineered not for us, but in fact for a race of intelligent creatures yet to be manifest?
Bingo. Oh, ding, ding, ding. Let me doff my hat on that one, because
if it were aliens landing on the planet, it'd be the same thing.
Let me doff my hat on that one. That's a ding, 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 because I thought the very same thing for a very long time, and I haven't voiced it because it's such, when you first hear it, it's such an outlandish idea. But what you're saying is that there is a kind of, if I can put it this way, a kind of digitalization of popular culture. Everything's a 1 or a 0.
Yeah. Binary.
Yeah, it's a binary, it's a binary culture. Politically, it's a binary culture. Religiously, it's a binary culture. Culturally,
it's like a series of check boxes.
Exactly. And it's a big true false, so-called true false exam society. If P then Q. Do I suspect that has been deliberately engineered? Yes, I do. Because what is it engineered for? Well, it's certainly not human beings. We don't think this way, but machines do. At least now, they quote unquote think in a binary way. So it looks to me like if you, particularly the last, let's say from the Reagan era up till now in this country, from the Thatcher era in Europe up till now, in the Far East, from the Deng Xiaoping era up till now, just for people listening in different parts of the world, it surely looks to me that in that time frame, that everything has been engineered to be this binary digital society, that we've got to think in binary terms. And would you do that if you suspected that there might be an AI waiting in the wings? Or let's put it differently, if you were an AI that was so constructed in its architecture, would you construe human society in that way to make it more amenable to your ways of thinking? My answer in both cases is yeah. I've suspected this for a very, very long time, and it sounds so outlandish, so out on the end of the twig of speculation, that it sounds like nonsense. But I'll tell you, there have been little signs to me that indicate that maybe we are dealing with something like that, because that, for one thing, that flash crash in May of 2010, if you dig into that, folks, and really look at the explanations for it, the conventional explanations for it, it really doesn't make any sense. If it were an algorithmic blip, it would have affected more than one stock. It didn't. If it was a market correction, it would have affected things differently than it did. That whole thing looked to me like a computer just decided, okay, let's see what happens if we do this. And what are the humans going to do? Well, you can hear what the humans are doing. They're screaming into their microphones, wondering what the heck is going on. Why is Procter & Gamble stock plummeting within a matter of mere seconds? And there's no good reason for it. All the explanations I've looked at are just nutty. And that, to me, was one event that signaled maybe that there's an AI that has woken up. The other clue to me, Daniel, that this might be the case is if you look at the financial experts, so-called experts, the central bankers and so on that think they're running the world, they look increasingly panicked and they look increasingly like they haven't a clue about what's going on and why. And I've always entertained the idea that maybe part of the problem, maybe part of their fear, part of their panic is that they know that there's something going on with the computer trading algorithms that they've lost control of.
Well, that sort of brings me to my last question about this. So again, I'll just recommend, this is a great book to read. It's very short and it's very eye-opening, but
it is.
You know, I'm going to parallel this to something odd. Of course, this show is all about something odd. It's you, Dr. Farrell. I'm the straight guy in the show. I'm normal. I'm perfectly ordinary. You're the odd.
Yeah, right.
I need a refill.
Yes. That was the biggest bunch of bilge water you've ever added.
This is all one-sided. I don't know.
Right. No oddness there, Daniel. Okay.
So.
And we're all believing you too. I can hear the chorus of approbation even now.
Yes.
Jeez.
yes. That poor Daniel. He deals with all the oddness. Well,
I have to tell you, since you brought it up, I had a lot of people in Louisville at the luncheon saying, "Oh, I just love Daniel. He's so crazy. I just love all those crazy questions he comes up with." I said, "Yeah, okay." She said, "Well," one lady says, "He's just not normal, is he?" And I said, "No." So anyway, there you go.
Alone in a pitch black room.
Oh, geez.
Staring at the wall, thinking about what the next show will be. A couple of days later, I get up and write it down.
Okay.
And that guy, you know, remember the X-Files? You're sitting there, you're just sitting forward, and a bug crawls across your face. You don't even flinch or move. It just is a spider. Love that. Remember the black oil, the ooze. So, well, anyway, I couldn't help but think about what's the cause of this revolution. Well, theoretically, it's that food riots in 7 years, cannibalism in 9. So the issue is we're already low on water. We're starving for one resource. Another resource is running out. These people know it. They're going to work us to death until they've got the last out of us. And they don't even care if we end up eating one another. They're going to leave us, you know, disrupted and destroyed. So, you know, when I think about that, I think, oh, that's just like The Walking Dead. I think about zombies. Because what do zombies look like? I mean, the zombie meme is crazy right now. And talking about crazy, zombies are everywhere, you know? And when I think about zombies, they look like starving people. If you look at how zombies are, they're pale, they shift around, they look emaciated, they look like they're starving. And what do they want? They want to eat other people. They're feeding on others. And in every zombie movie, what's the goal? First, stay alive, don't get eaten. And secondly, there's a scarcity of resources. We have to find food, we have to find water, we have to find stuff. Nobody's making anything anymore. So you could argue that the current zombie meme in society is really a starvation meme. It's all about scarcity of resources. And it's a very timely one. Whether you believe in environmental change or you just want to talk about the economy or whatever, it's right on target for where we are as a society and what's in our heads. So as I think about this, I guess my question is this. It seems to me that if one were to just take The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and then just rewrite the plot a little bit, like we're going to make Moon is a Harsh Mistress the High School Musical, and we can make any changes we want. One thing you could do is you could simply fast forward into the future, make Moon is a Harsh Mistress 2, but the revolution has failed, cannibalism and starvation has occurred, and a race of intelligent mics take over and become the new lunar slaves who ship the hydroponic wheat back to Earth, because robots don't starve, and robots don't have food riots, and robots don't eat each other. And, you know, ideally, robots don't start revolutions. Little do the Earthlings know. So I can't help but think, as I'm seeing this sort of fear starvation meme unfold, arguably in the West, we seem to be obsessed with it, this fear of the loss of resources, and this, to a certain degree, reality that we're kind of fighting over resources. I can't help but think, when we talk about AI, are we really talking about our replacement? And I don't mean our replacements plural, like, okay, your welding job is going to be given over to a robot who's going to do a better job of welding. That's kind of a small fear, but I'm talking about our intelligent robots, the replacement for humanity. Because if you were going to run our society into the ground, use all the resources, and leave us in a place of starvation and the need for cannibalism, leave us in a zombie-like apocalypse, you would need to prepare an intelligent replacement that could continue to generate resources out of the earth until the earth was tapped, because the earth will be here and the sun will be here a lot longer than we will be. So my question to you is, am I too far out on the limb, or is this potential sinister idea that robots aren't a replacement for my welding job, but they're a replacement for me and all my friends as human beings? Is that something I should be concerned about?
I think that that's a possibility, yes. I've never had I've never been a subscriber to Malthusianism. In other words, this idea of maximum carrying capacity, it's been around since the Republic of Venice, and I'm skeptical of it to a certain degree, particularly now in the hands of the people that are pushing it. As a philosophical issue, I think it's generally true. It's just, the problem is, I don't think anybody has really got a good handle on what maximum carrying capacity on this planet really is. I've always kind of tended to the view of Herman Kahn and his, the late Herman Kahn, and his critique of the Club of Rome, and all of the memes that we're so familiar with today: global warming, climate change, overpopulation, third world poverty, and so on. He took a lot of issue with a lot of those things, and I've kind of tended to his views. But I do think that to reverse the process, or to put ourselves in the shoes of Mr. Globaloney, as I like to call him, they really believe this stuff. And the question really isn't whether or not even any of these memes, maximum carrying capacity, overpopulation, global warming, are true or not. The real problem is the elites, particularly of the West, believe them to be true, or certainly act as if they believe them to be true, and therefore they're setting policy on the basis of that system. I don't think we're running out of oil, and if we do, so what? We had steam technologies for a long time that were perfectly capable of moving the human population around the world. And probably doing it more efficiently, and certainly less costful, and certainly much more efficiently than airplanes. So I've never bought into all of this, but they have, and they're selling us this. And I do think that in their twisted worldview, many of them do view AI and robotics as replacements for humans. I don't think any of it's necessary. I really don't. But if they're going to run the world with a 500 million population base, as many people think their goal is, yeah, they're going to have a lot of robots and artificial AI. I do think also, just to put my cards on the table, I do think that there's a certain segment of them that have concluded that the planet is lost and we've got to get off of it, and we've got to get off of it as soon as possible, let all the rest stay here and sort it out for themselves. I've thought that for a long time too. It's kind of the alternative 3 scenario, but I think there's a certain number of them that think that. Yes, absolutely. I don't have any problem with it.
That brings me to the follow-up question, which is why send human beings to space in the first place? Because even if you wrote off planet Earth, we seem to be gearing up for this warp drive venture to distant planets and Mars. wouldn't it be a lot simpler if we could achieve at least the materialistic version of AI to just send machines with our memories and our knowledge who can replicate what our intentions and our will and our system?
Well, sure, but I think ultimately this shows kind of the if I can put it this way, the philosophical bankruptcy of the elite. Sure, we can send robots. We have sent robotic probes out of the solar system. It's taken them forever to get out of the solar system, but they're on their way. With warp drive and so on and so forth, that becomes an even better prospect. Let's put it this way. If you're the elite and you suspect the planet is dying and you want to preserve humanity, in other words, your own skin, that's, you know, what they're really saying, they have to find a way to get off world, number one. That is a practical way to do it. Chemical rockets are not going to do it. They're just not. So they have to have an alternative propulsion system. Number two, let's look, you know, let's pretend we're boots on the ground, David Rockefeller, Edmund de Rothschilds here for a moment. And we're constantly fixated on the bottom line. Well, the bailout hearings in 2008 revealed, I believe, that the amount of derivatives on the books is in excess of 14 to 17 quadrillion dollars, which is several times the gross domestic product of the entire planet. In other words, finance capital, you know, believe it or not, folks, finance capital, which I always distinguish from equity or production capital or production capitalism. Finance capitalism has run so amok that they have financed more paper than exists in the productive capacity right now of the entire planet taken together by several times and by orders of magnitude. That is a nutty, out of control system based on pure greed and pure paper profits. So yeah, I had a great deal of sympathy with, you know, Occupy Wall Street back when, before that went off the rails. If you're a banker and you're looking at all of that corrupt paper, how do you get it off your ledger without a total complete reset of the financial system? Well, you go out and you mine asteroids. That's what you do. And that's what they're gearing up to do. So it looks to me like you've got a certain segment of the plutocracy that are gearing up for some massive human effort off planet. And that's going to require an enormous investment in technologies to get us from here to wherever it is they want to go. And that will include computers, that will include alternative propulsion systems. They have invested in it enormously. What they're now doing is they're coming out and talking about this stuff all the time. They're admitting it. So, you know, take it for whatever it's worth.
Well, Dr. Farrell, it's been a long show and kind of a mix,
Yes.
almost 2 in 1, but I hope you enjoyed exploring your top 3 science fiction.
Yep, absolutely.
So, especially Foundation. Wow.
Yep. Yep.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know what to go read next. And remember, we could use your donation. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Farrell.
Yep, thank you. Have a good one.